Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the fourth meeting in 2014 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to turn off their mobile devices as they do affect the broadcasting system, but having said that, some members may be accessing their papers on their tablets. Agenda item 1 is a decision to take business in private. Can I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 4, which is consideration of the evidence we've heard on NPF 3 in private? Is that agreed? That is agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is the draft third national planning framework. Today we're going to hear ministerial evidence on the draft third national planning framework, and I welcome Derek Mackay, Minister for Local Government and Planning, Keith Brown, Minister for Transport and Veterans, David Anderson, Head of Planning and Design of Transport Scotland, Fiona Simpson, Assistant Chief Planner, and Helen Wood, Principal Planner from the Scottish Government. Can I also welcome Patricia Ferguson, MSP, who's joining us for the MPF 3 evidence. Minister for Local Government and Planning, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you and good morning, Convener. The proposed National Planning Framework 3 is a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy. It's about our ambition to create high-quality places that support sustainable economic growth across the country, realising our opportunities for development and investment. It brings together our plans and strategies to provide a coherent vision for how Scotland as a place should evolve over the next 20 to 30 years. From the beginning of the process, I have been clear that I want the National Planning Framework and Scottish planning policy to focus the planning system on economic recovery, the transition to the low-carbon economy and sustainable economic growth. The spatial strategy set out in NPF 3 aims to achieve balanced and sustainable growth across Scotland. It plays to our strengths, highlighting, for example, the role of city regions and towns in continuing to attract investment, and it highlights where planning can help to reduce disadvantage. The vision for our future development describes Scotland as a successful, sustainable place, a low-carbon place, a natural, resilient place and a connected place. But it is more than just a vision. The National Planning Framework will be taken forward by development plans and in decisions on planning applications, making a real difference to our places and our communities. To help guide this, the proposed NPF 3 explains what the strategy means for our cities and our regions, towns, rural areas, coasts and islands. I understand the committee is interested in 14 proposed national developments. We designed a process for identifying national developments, having reflected on the views of Parliament in its response to NPF 2. For the first time, we issued a call for national developments at the outset of the process. Over 240 proposals were formally submitted. And also, for the first time, the analysis of these proposals was published for further consultation alongside the main issues report in April 2013. Every proposal has been considered carefully, firstly against our published criteria and then in relation to the wider spatial strategy. But as well as this, we considered what benefit there would be of national development status, and this could take the form of streamlining consent or attracting wider interest, partnership or investment. As a result, we've made choices and prioritised the projects that best reflect our spatial vision and are considered to be in the national interest. National development status does not automatically grant planning consent. Robust planning and assessment is still required for these projects and proposals to come forward as development applications and proposals. Neither does it imply a Scottish Government spending commitment. Instead, it provides greater certainty for investors and delivery partners by establishing the need for these developments. The draft action plan contains more detail on the lead partners for each individual project. I have no doubt that the committee will hear a wide range of views about the national developments we have proposed, and will be representations from those who contend that other projects should also be given national development status. I want to emphasise that although we focus on 14 national developments, many of these bring together several individual proposals. Many other proposals are also recognised and supported within the wider strategy. I'm also conscious that the committee has an interest in other issues, including transport, infrastructure and housing. These are key issues for planning in Scotland, separately and when considered together. For transport, I want to stress that the proposed NPF 3 supports rather than replaces the Infrastructure Investment Plan and the Strategic Transport Projects Review. Our vision is for Scotland to be a connected place, and that means not only improved transport infrastructure, but also better digital connections. For housing, our approach has been to promote positive and flexible planning for housing in NPF3 and to focus on achieving this through strategic and local development plans. The draft SPP, Scottish Planning Policy, set out our view on how this can best be achieved. And I welcome the opportunity to discuss the proposed NPF3 with the committee today, and Mr Brown and I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Alex Johnson, you're going to start off questioning today, please.
Yes. Can I start, going on from your opening statement, can I ask how does the proposed framework tie in with the policies and proposals set out in the Infrastructure Investment Plan, the Strategic Transport Projects Review and the National Transport Strategy?
As with many other strategies, they've been pulled together to be embodied in a spatial expression in the national planning framework. So a number of the projects that have been outlined where the planning system can add value, they've been expressed as having priority in here. So there's a two-way relationship between them, that the investment plans then inform NPF3, and that allows us to consider whether that added status that can be attached from either national development reference priority within NPF3 makes a difference. Because NPF3, as I say, is not a spending document, it's a planning document. For some, it's an interpretation of what matters as a material consideration in the planning system. For others, it will be an investment document for Scotland. But I think it very helpfully outlines where planning can add value to the system and to individual projects where that's necessary.
All the transport projects included in the National Planning Framework are either committed projects or projects at an advanced stage of development. Can you explain why this is and why there's no indication of the possible next round of major transport projects from 2025 onwards?
I think that's a very fair question from Mr Johnson, and to answer that I would refer you back to the decision-making process for the individual strategies. So Mr Brown, in his ministerial capacity, will still be considering the infrastructure and transport projects for the future, those that might be emerging and how they would be considered and prioritised. What this does is express, specifically in terms of infrastructure, investment and transport, what is required by the nation, where it can add, the planning system can add value and give certainty. And for that reason, the kind of iterative process, the stage process of considering infrastructure investments would consider as have been done at the moment, and that would further inform any future NPF3 or indeed planning policy itself would be taken into account. And for the first time, we've integrated NPF3 with Scottish planning policy, reviewing it at the same time and coming to a conclusion at the same time, in which a connected place features. But all the other government strategies, such as decisions around investment for transport projects, would still take place in the normal fashion, and consultation on that would be undertaken through the Strategic Transport Review or investment considerations. But this is a spatial expression of existing government plans. Where the new elements, I suppose, come in would be from other areas that are maybe more of a surprise, like from the private sector or development proposals that might be emerging. I suppose one example of that could be emphasis around energy and storage, where it's entirely private sector led, so it's not for government to say it must happen, but in terms of the planning regime, we would present a very supportive framework. An example of that would say about Cruachan in terms of energy and storage. So I'm just giving an example how it differs somewhat from the private sector bringing forward proposals to how the government brings forward proposals which are embodied in individual strategies that have already been subject to some scrutiny and now feature in NPF3 in a joined up and integrated way. I hope that answers the question.
The final question I'd like to ask is a bit more specific, and it relates to high-speed rail. It's again been designated a national development, quite rightly in my view. But is it possible to provide some kind of update on how it fits into development? That's both the Edinburgh-Glasgow issue of a high-speed rail link and the greater issue of the UK-wide high-speed rail mechanisms.
I think on 2 points. First of all, you'll know that we have the ongoing preparation of the business case for Edinburgh to Glasgow high-speed rail, which should come to ministers in the next few weeks. And that obviously gives us more certainty about how we intend to take that forward. But in considering, for example, the Edinburgh to Glasgow improvement projects, we have taken into account the idea this may happen, and what we should not do is get involved in abortive expenditure or plans which we would have to then supersede the Edinburgh to Glasgow improvement projects by then imposing high-speed rail on top of that. So that's what we're doing within Scotland. In the UK terms, you'll know that we have, for the first time, real engagement with High Speed 2. Patrick McLaughlin has agreed that. So that's looking at things such as possible routes, the implications of the High Speed 2 for a further extension onto Edinburgh and Glasgow. And generally, we are continuing with the proposal, working with the partnership group, which includes Glasgow City Council, Edinburgh City Council, various other partners, chambers of commerce and so on, to continue to put pressure onto the UK Government to make it as an early commitment. We still don't have that commitment from the Government, but we are pleased to welcome the fact that we do have the engagement with HS2. So the two things are running alongside just now.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark.
I wonder if you could just go into a bit more detail as to how particular projects are designated as national developments, particular think about transport projects, similar size and scale, which are included, but others such as A9, Julian, for example, aren't included. I wonder if you just go into a bit more detail on that.
Again, that's a helpful question, and I suppose the example you give will help me make the point. Because we know that investment decisions have been taken around individual projects, they'll feature in transport plans. The question of whether they feature as a national designation, and here we pose the question, does it meet the criteria, first of all, to be considered as a candidate proposal, and then there's further scrutiny beyond that. And we have the whole matrix here, if you're suffering from insomnia, that can be shared on individual projects. But crucially, does an added planning status add any value? Now, the work that you've referred to will be happening as planned for, and therefore that added status is not required. That's the case for a great number of transport proposals, particularly the roads proposals, where MPF3 planning status doesn't add value, but because they're reported to the country, they're referenced in the documents. So that's the difference between the two, that generally transport is of such significance to achieve our vision as a well-connected place that it's referenced, but whether it meets national development status, it has to reach the criteria. Now, that's not to say it will or it won't happen. It's just to say whether the planning system is generally supportive in terms of the hierarchy within that arrangement. And the developments were all scored under a range of factors, including reduction of emissions to meet targets, job creation, improving quality of the built and natural environment. So we're very transparent and clear on what the criteria was for every single candidate project, then how they would be analysed and weighted and then presented to committees for consideration. But the project such as A9 that you mentioned is actually referenced in MPF3, so it does have significance attached to it. It just doesn't require national development status to proceed.
Jim.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I'd like to ask about the proposed framework's role in encouraging and assisting the development of policies that encourage the modal shift from car and public transport to active travel, including cycling. I think that's probably one for the Minister for Transport.
I'm happy to answer that. I think you've seen the references in the document to the National Planning Framework to active travel. We've had quite a substantial number of responses on that issue. How do we promote active travel? You'll also be aware of the additional monies which John Swinney has allocated to that. And given the responses that we've had, a lot of people are asking about specific questions or routes for new versions or new additions to the National Cycling Network. But the process that we use for that, and we said this in our responses to the individual councils and others who come back on this, is that that's done through Sustrans. So we allocate the money. We say to Sustrans, this project, for example, the one you'll be aware of in Edinburgh, comes out of that pot. But it's for the local authorities concerned to come forward with their proposals, working with Sustrans. Our role in that really is in relation to funding and going back to the Edinburgh project to try and provide an exemplar project which could be used for other authorities to learn lessons from that. Just going back to the previous answer on the A9, the one other way it comes in is as we proceed with the A9, which is in the infrastructure and investment plan, so the substantive decision has been taken that we will both proceed with that and complete it by 2025. We're also looking at, for example, we've set up a small group to look at, with Sustrans, the active travel network coming down the A9. So one of the issues has been that the maintenance has not been as it should have been for that active travel network. So looking at things even like future trunk road operating contracts, including the obligation to look after that active travel corridor coming down the A9 as well. So it links in, but what we've said, as I think Derek's previously referred to, is these will require local authorities working with Sustrans to come forward with proposals for specific projects.
I'm interested in what you say, Minister, about exemplar projects. I mean, I accept what you say about the government setting the direction of travel and leaving it, allocating the expenditure and then leaving it to local authorities to pursue that. But isn't there more that can be done to promote exemplar projects so that we actually implement the policies and the frameworks? So, for example, there is a commitment to have for local authorities to identify one walking and cycling friendly project where accessibility will be significantly improved. Now, that's set out in the framework. So how does government do more to encourage local authorities to take that forward?
Well, that is the process. What we're saying is to local authorities, and mainly through Sustrans, is that you look at these projects, you know your area better than we do, you know what the gaps are. In my own area, for example, Clackmannanshire has got a very well developed element of the National Cycle Network, but they have gaps. So it's best for local authorities to talk to Sustrans. And of course we have a role when it comes to actually signing off the project. We have that role to make sure that happens. But the point I was making about the Leith Walk development is that as an exemplar project, other large urban areas in Scotland can look at that and see how they can learn the lessons from that. So it is a kind of iterative process whereby authorities know what they want to do. I have to say some authorities have been much more proactive in this than others, but we want to try and encourage all local authorities to get involved in this. But they are best placed to say what their needs are in their area. So them working with Sustrans is a kind of bottom-up approach, if you like. Derek was wanting to add something to that as well.
Purely from the planning point of view, I think it should be welcomed that for the first time in terms of that modal shift that a long-distance cycling and walking network is being established with that priority as a national development. So I think that should be welcome, just as one example of how we're changing policy to add more emphasis to that. That's not to say that someone has to walk the entire route, incidentally, in one day, but what it identifies is the gaps in the system. And Mr Brown made a point about his constituency when I visited and considered this for inclusion with MPF 3. The national cycling route, it meets a blockage. It's actually a pretty heavy roundabout, and it makes the point when making all future planning decisions, we should be thinking about the impact on accessibility and transport and do it maybe in a more stringent way than we've been able to do it in the past. So from the policy perspective, I think it tightens up where we are in that modal shift, as well as supporting other areas such as electrification of networks and transition to the low-carbon economy as well. I think there's a range of policy indicators in here and guides that will help planning authorities make decisions. And you talked about exemplars as well. I'll give you an example of designing streets is very accessibility friendly, and we've promoted it and we've analysed it, and we know that more developers now need to take it up and deliver it. So we're using those exemplars as good practice and share it across the country.
Could I just go back to the commitment in the framework to identify one walking and cycling friendly settlement? There is a timescale attached to that, which is 2030, and in evidence to the committee last week, John Lauder of Sustrans said he did not, and I quote, "I do not understand the 2030 date. It does not fit in with the cycling action plan." Is that the government's ambition, or is it possible for that date to be brought forward? Is that something you can comment on?
I think, as with in many areas, it will be partly dictated by the resources which are available. So if it's possible, and you've seen, I think, fairly strong evidence for additional commitment from the government to this, if we have additional resources, then obviously we can take that further forward. But I do emphasise the point, which I think John Lauder will be aware of, that these are partnership commitments. It's not just simply the government saying we'll do this. We're not going to say to a council, we're coming into your area, we're doing this active travel project. It's done in partnership. So it does rely on different people coming together, and it does rely on having the resources available to do that. So I think, as with many of these things, going back to the A9, we've given a date of 2025. We are currently examining very closely if we can bring that forward at all, if there's anything we can do to bring that forward. And that will be true in most policy areas as well. I would also say, though, that many of these aspirations are really dealt with in the context of a very tough budget environment. We've had about 11% cut to our revenue budget, about 26% cut to our capital budget. So I think it's better to make sure that we have the time available to do this, but be aware of the opportunities which might present themselves if you can do it earlier. So there shouldn't be... we shouldn't have to wait that long for all local authorities to come forward with their own proposal, as is referenced in the document. But it will be dependent upon resources and partners willing to work together.
Can I just follow up on that? You know, in terms of having walking and cycling friendly spaces, I totally and utterly agree with that. But how is it that we have, for example, in my constituency, development going up at the moment, that there are no pavements outside the houses? How do local authorities get away with allowing a developer to do that when we're talking about trying to make places have living streets?
Well, Convener, every planning application, of course, would be considered on its merits, and in current SPP and emerging SPP, Scottish Planning Policy, you would expect that the local environment's taken into account, accessibility, safety, access, and so on. So I'm not aware of the nature of development. I can't use the excuse it's a live application. If you say it's already been built, that I can't refer to it. But we would expect the basic minimum requirements to be met. But the best practice that we're seeing, I suppose, can be exemplified through a development, say, at Paulnoon in East Renfrewshire, where the developer went over and above that which they had to do to design a quality place, in which there's designated space and there's real accessibility, and it's a very attractive environment. And they got not just the balance right, but I think it's an exemplar we should share across the country, and that's why we have been promoting the Designing Streets policy. So I can't refer to individual applications that a planning authority may have considered, but clearly we want safe, accessible places for development. So I'd be surprised if there weren't any considerations of either current or emerging planning policy.
Okay, Mark, you wanted to come back on airports.
Yep, just to ask how you reconcile the Scottish Government targets on climate change with the designation of the expansion of five airports.
Well, we believe that the inclusion of the airports is important to the economy of Scotland. Clearly is the gateway to Scotland, important to business and travellers and the population at large. So I think it's very welcome that we've upgraded the airports in the National Planning Framework 3 from NPF 2. Some would have you believe we've diminished their or downgraded their status, but it's actually been upgraded to national development status, and we think that's right because it will contribute to sustainable economic growth. But clearly there's a counterbalance in emissions. There's development within aviation at the moment in terms of the emissions that they're producing. I suppose that will continue. And with greater accessibility and direct flights at Scottish airports, that may also have an impact rather than the connections having to be elsewhere. I think there's a range of factors that you would bear in mind when it comes to the airports. And the other element of it is that they are a dynamo for the economy, but we think that any increase there would be offset by a whole range of other policies around energy, other forms of transport, the modal shift and other contributions to climate change targets. So we think, like with everything else, it's a balance, but we've struck the right balance between economic growth and greater protection of the environment.
Coming on that point, I think the other point as well is that the expansion plans which individual airports have very often, I think in all cases, include an aspiration for greater numbers of direct flights and direct routes. And of course, if you have that, then you don't have to have the intermediate short-haul flight, which is environmentally damaging to a greater extent than the long-haul flights. So this could actually help if we can actually get more direct routes into each of the airports. And it's also true to say the expansion which is referred to often includes things, for example, at Aberdeen Airport, which are about customer service, better security arrangements, better customer comfort as well. So it's an expansion in terms of the quality of service offered, and the expansion in terms of the actual air business that's done often includes reference to direct flights which are less environmentally damaging.
And also bear in mind that some of this status is about the development around the periphery of the airport, how that can be a dynamo for growth, rather than necessarily just an increase in the number of flights, or say an aspiration to have an extra runway that might never materialise. But the other consequential development from airport growth would be welcomed in terms of jobs and economic growth.
Does anyone else have any?
Convener.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Big point on board about technological advances and the reduction in carbon from direct flights, but also on the access side, where reducing the carbon footprint would be more efficient access to airports, and just ask why the surface access strategy has been removed from MPF3 when it's been in previous versions of the document. That was something that was also commented on by witnesses last week.
Look,
the surface access strategy, for example, in relation to Glasgow Airport, has been taken forward by the airport. In fact, it's coming to something of a conclusion currently, but that's been taken forward by the airport themselves, the Glasgow Airport surface, the study which has been done. So, and I think what we've done is increased or enhanced the designation for Glasgow Airport within this MPF3 document, and at the same time, as we recognise, it's not always about what the government does. We're a partner in that study, and it's been taken forward by the airport. And there's nothing in NPF3 which precludes us taking anything that comes from that forward. NPF3 is much more about enabling the environment to have these things taken forward. So I don't think there's any downgrading of the issues that we're looking at in relation to surface access.
Okay. Do any members have any further questions on transport and digital infrastructure then, before we move on? Okay, if we move on to housing, Mark, I think you're up for that again.
Yep. Committee also heard concerns that sort of follows on from the convener's previous question, that developments aren't meeting Scottish Government best practice on street design and digital infrastructure. And on that digital infrastructure point in particular, I know of developments going up, and people who are moving into those developments sometimes automatically expect a modern house to have a modern internet connection, and it just doesn't seem to be the case in a lot of developments. Just to ask how the framework and associated Scottish planning policy would tackle that.
I think we have to be mindful of what MPF3 and planning policy is about. It's really about decisions about land use, not necessarily the quality of the product specifically, although I absolutely agree it's a fair assumption and expectation that the developer provides the infrastructure to be connected. In terms of our role as a government, we are supportive of the rollout of digital technology. That's why we've got major investment around that. Around the planning regime as well. The policies are being updated and strengthened in terms of the national infrastructure. That's why we're attaching significance as a national project in here as well. In terms of going beyond, as you have done, MPF3 into individual planning policies, it doesn't feel particularly proportionate to set a planning policy around the quality of digital connection, even though I agree with you, it's something that individual developers should certainly do. Now, we set conditions around, say, building control on, say, energy standards. It might be more appropriate there than in a planning policy. That's the way that planning policy operates, because it's a decision around land use, not necessarily the internals of that property. But I absolutely agree with the sentiment, but I think developers should consider best practice there, and there's a reason it's called best practice, but for many it should be seen as minimum. But in terms of the policy, supportive across the country, So we've got rollout, we've got coverage in every part of the country. There's investment, there's policy support and the planning system, but we can't compel a developer to connect to broadband as much as we think that that's attractive. It wouldn't be competent within the planning system.
Could, if broadband was designated as a utility, is that a possibility?
I like your creative thinking, convener, but we're trying to keep the purity of the planning process about decisions on land use and what's appropriate development and what's not, and given a sympathetic process. I have actually met with digital operators, and they share an ambition to take it to every part of the country, and they're surprised with some of the partners that they work with. And so there's liaison with Homes for Scotland, for example, and how we can encourage developers to deliver this. It's actually in their interest as well as in the interest of individual purchasers and indeed tenants. But it's not something the planning system can compel, frankly. We can make it available, we can give a supportive planning environment through government actions. We're rolling it out, we're taking coverage to as much as the country as quickly as we can. But we can't compel individual developers within the planning system to connect to broadband. And my officials will reassure me that that is indeed the case.
Can I just emphasise the point that Mr Mackay's made about how we try to work within that? CalMac, for example, travel to many parts of the country which are quite remote, and they are looking actively now at whether in providing Wi-Fi on their ferries and also in some of the ports and harbours, they can also provide a more general community benefit to some of these more remote areas through the work that they do. So the government is trying to look at these things across the piece, and where there are opportunities to provide greater coverage, we're taking that forward.
It's good to hear there's some kind of joined up thinking in some parts of the country. Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. Just to continue the housing theme, in evidence last week, Professor Bramley stated in reference to Greenbelt, if we consider the development economics and the residual land values for every house that is built in that area, there will be hundreds of thousands of pounds of free development gain to the landowner. We should be capturing that to pay for the infrastructure. Is there a need for a mechanism to allow enabling infrastructure works to be funded by the developer or landowner, and is this something the government is considering?
Right now, if for any development to proceed, any mitigation that's required has to be delivered. And of course that's a matter sometimes of negotiation as to what's delivered, how and when. But for any development to proceed, where there's a question around infrastructure contribution and so on, the planning system is already constructed in a way that demands that, requires it, and therefore it's delivered through the planning obligations, or sometimes the conditions, but the planning obligations. So I believe that that is already the case, where development requires infrastructure improvement to make it happen, then that happens at the moment. Now, you may question some of the decisions that planning authorities take, but that's already a requirement in the planning system.
And is that, what, 100% of the additional cost, or is it a far lower proportion?
Well, it depends on the nature of the application and the nature of the development. If, for example, if a housing development was required and some extra resource might be required for a school. Now, you would think about, well, what proportions fare then from that development to that school. The same for, say a road connection. You can't build half a junction, of course, but if a junction is required to support the growth of a housing development, then you would require the applicant to contribute towards that, and generally it would be the full cost. It's a matter still for the planning authority, but generally the approach would be the full cost of the development. What I often have to guard against as a planning minister is that sometimes planning authorities have maybe asked for that wee added extra, a bit of icing on the cake, which is in the public spirit and it's in public benefit. I understand the reason for it. As a former local authority councillor, I know sometimes you try and get that bit extra for public good. And whilst that was well-intentioned, it doesn't fit within the spirit of planning legislation. It really should be what mitigation is required to allow the development to happen, and it generally is full cost. As I say, sometimes there's flexibility within that, but that would be for the planning authority to determine, and they might do it for a range of reasons. Hopefully that answers your question, Mr MacDonald.
The committee also heard that the location of housing developments in some cases is being driven more by the wishes of developers than planning authorities. What guidance does the proposed frameworks and SPP provide on the location of large-scale housing developments?
Well, we believe in the plan-led system, but a plan-led system requires credible plans. So my challenge to planning authorities is to make sure all their development plans are credible, are up to date and are robust, have been consulted upon and can inspire confidence. And we've put a great deal of effort around that. So we would hold that the plan-led system, i.e. where the planning authority has suggested development should go, should be the foundation of the planning system. That said, developments don't have to happen within that particular zoning if material considerations allow you to depart from the plan. And that's made all the more vulnerable if a planning authority doesn't have a robust, credible, up-to-date local development plan, which unfortunately far too many planning authorities still have. The law says a development plan should be less than 5 years old. It may surprise you to learn that almost half of them are older than 5 years old. So we believe in a plan-led system, but local authorities have to deliver. And that's why much of the actions were discussed in Parliament over the last weeks and months hopefully will precipitate an improvement in that. So to answer your question, yes, planning authorities should be determining through their plans and that engagement with their communities where development should go, but there will be circumstances where that doesn't apply and development can still be justified either by application, but only if it can be shown in a transparent way that it was a material consideration that would allow such a decision.
Do you see any conflict between Scottish planning policy and planning advice? Planning policy says the redevelopment of urban and rural brownfield sites is preferred to development on greenfield sites, and some of the planning advice notes refer to marketability, where planning authorities discuss with housing providers what can be developed.
No, I think they're compatible because the hierarchy starts with MPF3 and SPP, and the planning advice notes are to advise those making decisions what should be taken into account. And it is fair to say that when producing the plans on the generous supply of housing, land and sustainable places, it would be unfair to developers, it would be unfair to communities to have whole tracts of land that were not developable, either because there was no demand or they were contaminated or were too complex. So it would be pointless having a land supply system where you couldn't actually market the houses. So I actually think the planning advice notes support policy which generally supports the principle that you've suggested, not just with housing but in many other areas, that we should look to develop brownfield sites or previously developed land as it's also understood to be first, before we turn to other areas such as the green belt. Of course we would rather develop those locations first. But again, when you take it to local circumstance, there might be a range of reasons why you have to do that.
Last week, Professor Bramley stated, "I would be suspicious of just asking developers to tell us about marketability. We should have our own independent assessment of the economics and viability of developments, and that should be what influences our decisions. In most parts of Scotland, but not all areas, a housing development is viable, and we should not just let developers cherry-pick." What's your view on that, and is this something in terms of independent assessment that the Scottish Government would consider?
I don't think you can make generalised comments about the planning system because it's far too complex and particularly sensitive to local circumstances. But I suppose developers on the whole will be looking to find the best sites, the sites that they can, if we're talking about private sector developments, of course they will want the sites that can be marketed and people want to buy. And I suppose it could be argued that that's responding to market demand and individuals' need where they want to live. But the reason you can't generalise is we know that there's developments in city centres, in town centres, in previously developed land and proposals for further regeneration. So I don't think you can take a black and white approach on that. Developers don't get to cherry pick because we ask for an independent analysis. It's called the planning system, and the planners take an impartial view on all the factors that have to be weighed up in any planning application, and they make a determination based on the facts and the material considerations. And if they don't trust the information they're presented with, they can probe it further, and there can be, as I say, further analysis of that. And any large-scale development, where appropriate, would also require an environmental impact assessment as well. But again, the planning system should be proportionate and fair and transparent, and sometimes, but more so in other areas of planning, it's very fraught with difficulty. he who pays the piper calls the tune, it's said, is it not? And if you pay a consultant to write up a report, then you attach the weight you want to attach to their findings as it's presented in any planning application. But I trust the planning profession, as many others do, to make the right decisions and weigh up those considerations. And of course, if it's going to committee, it will then be for democratically elected local members to make those decisions.
And my final point is, you know, you've said that greenfield or greenbelt developments are the preferred developments, but is there any incentives that are in place to encourage developers to build on brownfield sites first? Through
the sequential approach, the hierarchy that we've got, there's policy encouragement to look there first, and in designating sites through the development plan process, we would be far more enthusiastic to find sites that were previously developed than greenfield sites so it's in a policy approach that we would take that, and that's why it's appropriate to MPF3 and specifically SPP. We won't propose any financial incentive, but when it comes to the public sector investment and housing, there would be a particular methodology to try and encourage development in, again, previously developed sectors. So the financial incentive wouldn't come in with the private sector, but it does exist in the public sector. And the reason I would highlight that is that the town centre debate we had in Parliament only a few weeks ago, we made the point that the town centre action plan talks about extending the sequential approach as it relates to retailing and locating in town centres first, extending that to all other parts of the planning system. And we proposed that to say, in addition to planning, other parts of the public sector should think about their investment decisions, and so for housing associations considering housing grant, yes, they too should look at town centre sites and previously developed land before turning to other sites. So it's very strong in policy, and it's not diluted in any way with what we propose. So the incentive is to get permission, apply with planning policy, and if you're choosing to go to a greenfield site, then you better have a very strong case for it to be considered and then approved.
Okay, thanks very much.
Do you want to come in on this?
Yes, please. Thank you, Convener. You said, Minister, that we have a plan-led system that can inspire public confidence, and you talked about developers looking for the best sites responding to market demand. But of course, they will understandably be looking to maximise their financial gain. Do you think there's a role within the planning system, without wanting to generalise, as you said, you didn't want to go down that particular route, is there a role for the planning system, for planning guidance, in actually setting a level of what would represent a fair return on a company's investment in order to allow them to make a profit, but without them profiteering at the public's expense?
There is no role for a mechanism as you've described, and I would propose no such role. Taxation can be dealt with in other ways, so I wouldn't propose that. However, for public good, I'm a bit concerned I've got a hear from the Conservatives, but no one else on that point. However, that would be a substantial change to the planning system, and the planning system should remain focused on decisions around the appropriateness of land use, and I shouldn't contaminate it with other, however well-meaning considerations. Planning must be about land use, but to assist. If, say, there was a housing development and there is an element of profit, that's exactly why we've constructed policies that consider not just profit, which is secondary, but need. So on affordable housing, we ensure that there's an adequate supply of affordable housing, and even in private sector developments, that there's still a quota or a share of affordable housing as part of that mix. So we achieve public good through a different mechanism to the one that you suggest.
Can I put the question a slightly different way and say, would you be equally concerned at presumption within planning guidance or heritage guidelines which identified a particular level of profit as being appropriate?
That would be inappropriate for the planning system, because what you're then engaging in is almost the ethics of the development company and considerations that are not particularly appropriate to planning. It's not for the planning system to make any judgment on what profit someone's making. It's for the planning system to get the right development in the right places and to meet local need and national need, and to do that in a fair and transparent way. It's nothing to do with ensuring that someone gets a slice of the cake.
Thank you.
Nice try though, Mr Eadie.
I think I got a useful reply on the record.
Mary, do you want to continue on this?
Yes, thank you. Following on from right developments in right places, we've heard evidence that retail, housing and business developments continue to be built around access by car with limited or no access to walking, cycling and public transport networks. So what can be done specifically through the NPF and the SPP to ensure all new developments are accessible by active and public transport?
I would say that we've put greater emphasis on that in MPF 3 and in emerging planning policy. You reference retail, where we've already got the sequential approach that development should be considered, for example, in town centres first. Why is that the case? Because town centres are generally more accessible than out of town or periphery or elsewhere or more remote locations. And I say there will be decisions from time to time where the economic impact or other considerations allow you to depart from that. But generally speaking, we propose that developments take place where the population can more easily access it through public transport, population hubs and so on. So I think that features quite strongly in planning policy as we propose and include the transition to the low carbon economy and everything else that goes behind that. But not just on retail, on housing too, and on any future developments. But that's why I would go back to the importance of a plan-led system. It sets out clearly where development should happen and where we should be channeling that development. And those policies suggest it should be, as you describe, Ms Fee, not random locations across the country because it might necessarily suit a developer. So it's very strategic how we've composed the policy. But you reference decisions taken contrary to that. It will still be for each planning authority to make the right decision in their area. But we absolutely support the direction of travel, pardon the pun, future developments to be more accessible, contribute to the low carbon economy and be prioritised in town centres where that's appropriate. And that's why we're extending the sequential approach.
Do you think then there is an opportunity or is it possible for more, shall we say, guidance to be given? Because to make that modal shift, to get people out of cars, to make the modal shift towards walking and cycling, and it's very aspirational, but it's a long-term policy. Is there an opportunity to give perhaps more guidance to local authorities on developments?
Having conducted, I think for the first time as a planning minister, a roadshow to every planning authority in the country, there's certainly a need for greater guidance so that planners know more clearly what's required of them. So for that reason, I will commit to, once we've concluded MPF 3 and SPP, to further guidance, because we'll have to do that to refresh and update the policies and maybe give them a bit more clarity, as you request, around what issues to take into account. Because a big issue here sometimes is, let's say there was a wonderful development proposed. It's maybe not in the plan-led system. You would want to understand as a planner what issues should you take into account. And there's the question of net growth, because sometimes it's just displacement now in development. You know, it's just an amalgamation of, well, the economic activity that was happening elsewhere simply been displaced. So one of the things I've been very keen on is to attach greater significance to economic impact in the planning system and greater weighting to it, but having a clear understanding what is genuine new net growth as opposed to just displacement from one place to another.
Okay, thank you. Why are no major housing developments identified as national developments? I mean, in the NPF there is emphasis given to certain areas where there is critical need of housing, but there are no developments identified.
Well, there are if you include Ravenscraig, of course, which is a national development and is predominantly housing, but the reason it is a national development is because it is mixed use. So I would disagree with the point that there's no housing developments. It might just be that housing is connected to the project as a whole. The policies are incredibly supportive of house building and growth in Scotland, because we know that even households are becoming smaller, so we will require more houses. We know there's housing demand. All the housing demand needs assessments tell us that. It'll happen at a different pace in different parts of the country. So the policies are very supportive of housing growth in Scotland, but national designation should only be attached where it meets all the necessary criteria to then get planning consent. But arguably, if we abide by all the policies we've discussed this morning, it will get consent. Just there was no individual national project that required this consent, other than Ravenscraig, which had a very clear reason to be included.
Okay. It's also been suggested to us in evidence that regional housing targets should be included in the MPF as opposed to strategic development plans. What's your view on that?
We've commissioned work on strategic development plans and what added value they give to the system. And so right now, housing need is determined through the local authorities' individual assessments, and then they deliver it as part of the development plan process. And I think that works broadly well and fine. However, some members will be very sensitive to the fact that then individual local authorities then get into the horse trading about who will be building the houses and where they're to go, and that sometimes conflicts with public opinion on where the site should be. So to try and address all of that, we should have full engagement at the earliest opportunity in determining the sites. We should find the right number of adequate sites that meet a generous land supply, and having clarity in the plan-led system should ensure that there is that adequate provision. And for that reason, I don't think that additional targets should be required, as long as we abide with the policies and the approach that we have at the moment. But I would concede, because it's obvious that there's conflict where individual local authorities feel as if they've done their bit and don't want to contribute to the wider target. But targets are there for a reason, and if we want the right number of houses in the right places, then there has to be a bit of give and take in the system. But I don't see what extra value another layer of a transfer of targets would help with in that respect.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Can I just come back just quickly on the point about major housing developments? What constitutes a major housing development, and at what point should it be included in the process?
Well, I knew you were going to ask a really difficult question like that. We don't have such a definition for the purpose of MPS 3 to in itself meet the criteria. We have the criteria that I have that covers a range of indicators that would then determine whether a project reached that status, not simply how many houses would it involve. So if it met, a few of the different criteria, then it could maybe feature. But my point is, in all of this, it's almost like a status symbol whether something has national designation. The question we have to pose is, what added value does that status add? And for a major housing development, if it was simply just a major housing development, it will be considered on its own merits and doesn't require MPF 3 status. The reason I would draw out Ravenscraig is it has so many other uses. It is creating a new town centre. It is quite unique. It is a massive piece of regeneration, and that's why, for a range of different criteria that it met, it became a national project. But generally, housing in itself wouldn't require to have that status.
As you're aware, there's a major issue in the west of Edinburgh, and Edinburgh's Garden District is up to 4,000 houses going to be proposed, and there was a public meeting last night with 150 people at it. That has a major impact on the existing communities, congestion on the existing arterial roads into Edinburgh, and there's a problem with air quality in the west of Edinburgh. We're already failing the European standard on air quality. Surely that is a major housing development that should be considered because of the impact it has on the west of the city and beyond.
I can't answer Mr McDonald's question, but I'm happy to go and look and see if it was one of the submissions we received and what factors were considered and get back to the member. But if you've suggested it's already a live application, I should say no.
Not live yet, no.
It's not live yet, but it's about to be.
Consulting, it's at plan stage.
I'm happy to look into the individual circumstances, but I think we could be here all week if you wanted me to explain why every project may happen to be in or out. And I think this is my second of 4 committees that will take some time to go through every project. But if you want me to engage with you individually on individual projects, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, anyone else got any further questions on housing then? Okay then, if we move off finally to water, Adam.
Thanks, Convener. Last week, gentlemen, we heard from Professor Gooch from the Scottish Centre for Water Policy. And he sort of flagged up to us that the proposed framework apparently doesn't show an understanding of issues around flooding and water runoff. And as we're all aware, we seem to be suffering from more extreme adverse weather events on a more frequent basis. Certainly in my constituency, we had some severe flooding events over the Christmas and New Year period. Are you aware of these concerns, and would you be prepared to look at this issue?
We've considered all the submissions and the evidence and look forward to the committee's finding, but it's our view that many of the environmental assessments and analysis that are required for any development to happen are adequate. Sometimes they're disproportionate, I have to say, but of course it's necessary to understand the impact on development and how that should be mitigated. And as we embrace the challenges of climate change and the ramifications of much of that, the planning system will have to be quite adept. But you know, I would not concur with the statement that we haven't taken these matters into account. Of course, their appropriateness in MPF3 is quite different from how we engage in them in SPP. But we would expect the environmental impact assessment or any assessments to take such issues into account. And what we've seen south of the border, of course, we'll take great interest in as well in terms of development on the floodplain and then the impact of that. But the government's put a great deal of effort into both flood prevention and our wider policies on the environment. I suppose that's why we now have some of the most ambitious climate change targets in the world, a very comprehensive set of policies as to how we would achieve that transition.
The other issue that was flagged up to us last week was that of waste management and the use of waste as a resource is not covered in any detail in the proposed framework. Can you explain the reasons for this, and could this be addressed in the final document?
It may not require to be an MPF3, but it absolutely will be addressed in Scottish planning policy, which is going through a slightly different process, much of which you've discussed today, intentionally or not, has been about SPP, not MPF3. So that's the place through planning policy we would more clearly address that. Because again, this is a spatial expression, so it might be wrong for us to say, and here's where we would put, for example, waste, national waste to energy plans. So that's not something we'd put in MPF3 unless we had a national plan to do that, which we don't. Because again, that's something we do in partnership with local authorities, and therefore the considerations that you take into account will be covered in SPP. I hope that reassures Mr Ingram.
Thank you.
Can I make one further point just around water, because I think it's worth making. We consider the negative consequence of environment, but there's also great potential in Scotland for storage and for being a hydro nation. I think that's very positively covered in the policies and is an emerging area for Scotland, one that I think is exciting a great number of people, and that's why the particular development for storage and giving an example at Crookham, a great example of where that might work for the benefit of the environment and consumer demand.
Okay, anyone else got any questions on water? Okay, if I can just go back to ask a question about digital and the National Fibre Network. Mark last week asked about the construction of new broadband cabling where length of cabling exceeds 8 kilometres, and we had Professor Foreman here, and he was a bit to him it was a bit of a mystery why there was this 8 kilometres mentioned. Can you shed any light on it, Minister?
I'm happy to defer to officials on that particular technical mystery. I'm sure Dr Fiona Simpson can answer adequately.
The 8-kilometre threshold has been used to describe the national development to ensure that only larger scale proposals are captured by the national development status. So that reflects a threshold that's used to define a major development, and we've used that in the national development description to avoid tying up smaller scale developments within the national development.
So if it's a large development and the fibre would cover more than 8 kilometres, then that's its designation?
Yeah, above 8 kilometres. Yeah.
Right. Are you any the wiser, Mark?
Go back to the professor.
And that's going to make a difference then in terms of digital rollout, is it?
The 8 kilometres will ensure that the large-scale digital infrastructure that's required is supported by the national development status, but it will also ensure that smaller-scale developments that are brought forward don't have additional processing and time allocated to them, so it won't slow down the process for the smaller-scale elements.
Okay. Anyone else got any further questions? Patricia?
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning. Good morning, Ministers. You will, I'm sure, both actually be aware of the Glasgow Canal Partnership, joint venture between the City Council, Waterside Regeneration, ISIS and BIG, along with the canals, the Scottish Canals. Obviously, there's been a great deal of regeneration and investment along the canal corridor, particularly in the north of the city and particularly actually in my constituency. And that corridor remains a strategic priority for the City Council and its partners going forward, and will be a focus of continued investment and concerted regeneration efforts over perhaps 5 to 10 years. And in fact, the developments have increased and become more ambitious even since NPF 2 was published, and yet they merited a mention in NPF 2 but don't seem to be in NPF 3. And I really just wondered if there was a particular reason for that.
I'm again happy to look into the individual details, because we're supportive of what Patricia Ferguson has said, so there's no reason for its submission. And partly the Central Scotland Green Network and a lot of the language and definition we use around that covers a lot of the projects in Central Scotland, and including in Glasgow. So we have tried to keep the document fairly concise, so if something's not fully expanded upon, it's not because it's not important or doesn't carry the government's support, it's just that we believe we've covered it in quite a principal way. Of course, happy to look at referencing it as the member suggests. It hasn't met the individual criteria. I'm not sure if it was submitted as an individual bid. If it was, then it would have been assessed along with the others. But we do believe there's a great deal of coverage in terms of an attractive place, regeneration, and it's within the Central Scotland Green Network area, so carries some of it carries support. So I'm happy to look further into it, especially if the member's seeking reference. But of course, the question I come back to is, does it require this to achieve planning progress? And I don't believe that it does require it, so it's not essential for its progress. But I appreciate the member would like its inclusion.
I can, Convener, understand. Sorry.
Can you just clarify whether it was there was a request to include it or not?
There were several proposals around the canals network, and we have reflected the importance of canals in relation to regeneration and in relation to the Metropolitan Glasgow Strategic Drainage Partnership work that's happening in Glasgow.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I understand the need for brevity, but in NPF 2 it simply said Rockhill, Keppoch and locations adjacent to the Forth and Clyde Canal are priorities for the regeneration in Glasgow. It's about half a line in the document, so I don't think, really the brevity of the document is really what's at issue. But in the previous NPF, a number of other projects within Glasgow were referenced, Clyde Gateway, and other regeneration projects. This is the only one that hasn't carried forward in that sense. And given it is so important to the north of the city, I think it would be worth mentioning in and of itself. Interestingly, the Metropolitan Drainage Project, a large chunk of which will also be in my constituency, is referenced, but it doesn't seem within at least the Glasgow and Clyde corridor element to mention the fact that that will be integral to the work that's going on, or at least the canal is integral to the work that's going on in the Metropolitan Drainage Project. So it just does seem to me that it is a bit of a gap, both in terms of regeneration and in terms of the connection to the drainage project, and I do genuinely think it would be worthy of inclusion.
If the member is of that view and committee agrees, I'm more than happy to include it in the Glasgow and Clyde Valley page and whatever iteration we then arrive at. I don't have any major difficulty with that. I thought if the member was making a full frontal bid for national designation, that might be chancing it somewhat, but I think a reference as suggested doesn't seem unreasonable and would fit within the narrative that we've currently got.
Can I just add that I think we have no objection to it being included. I'm not sure it adds anything to the process. There's quite a lot of the regeneration which was previously referred to has already been carried out in relation to the canals. It's part of a wider regeneration which is national in nature for Scottish canals, going right down from Inverness right across the country to Fort William and also in Falkirk as well. These are equally significant projects. I think the drainage scheme is a very exciting one, and I can see the national significance of that. But I think there's nothing that I can think that would be added to the project. What's happened up till now is when funds have become available, they've been allocated to different parts, adding to the different mix of the canal redevelopment in that area. Most recently, of course, the water sports development, very exciting development. But there's nothing, I don't think anybody in Scottish Canals or elsewhere has felt it's been an impediment to be able to do this because it might not be mentioned in the National Planning Framework. And I suppose it comes down to whether everything that's being done, whether by the government or others, should be in every document. And I think you would end up with very, very weighty documents. But I have no objection to it being in, but I don't think it's impeding any process.
If I may, Convener, I would just say to Mr Mackay, my ambitions for my constituency know no bounds. So the higher the designation it can have, the better, frankly. However, I would just say that within Glasgow and within the canal network in Glasgow, actually we've only seen a very small element of what we hope will be the overall investment over this 5 to 10 year period, and with some very ambitious ideas for the old Diageo distillery site adjacent to the water sports, and I very much welcome the additional investment there. I think that is a wonderful project and I look forward very much to seeing it in proper operation. But I think with that particular part of the project still to come, and some of the other developments that are likely to come on the back of some of the work that's been done at Sight Hill and elsewhere in my constituency, then I think actually it does merit that kind of recognition. And I think the canals would actually welcome it.
Okay. Anyone else got anything? Ministers, anything to add? Okay, that concludes item 2 on the agenda. I thank the witnesses for their evidence, and I will suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave and new ones to take their place. Okay, if we can resume. Our third item of business today is to hear evidence on the Housing Scotland Bill from representatives of letting agents' organisations. So I welcome Kathleen Geld, convener of the Council of Letting Agents, Jonathan Gordon, chair of PRC Forum from the RICS Scotland, and Ian Potter, managing director of the Association of Residential Letting Agents, and Malcolm Warwick, chairman of Let Scotland. And I also welcome Patrick Harvey, MSP, who's joined us. So can I invite questions from members? And I think, Adam, you're going to start us on this section.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's start with a gentle opening question, a general question. The Scottish Government has a vision, and I quote, that all people in Scotland live in high-quality, sustainable homes that they can afford and that meet their needs. So to what extent do you think this bill's provisions support this vision? Who would like to start?
Who would like to start?
Yeah.
Mr. Potter.
Thank you. I think it goes some way towards it. It's like any other piece of legislation. It depends how well it is enforced. I mean, at the moment, we have legislation that does look at the fitness of property, generally. There's a lot of evidence that that is not overly enforced by local authorities who have the statutory powers. And if we're just going to create another piece of legislation that's not going to be meaningfully acted upon, then I would say it's not going to achieve what you're trying to achieve with it. We have other areas within the private rented sector that would be examples of that as well. Landlord registration. We know that not every landlord is registered. And some local authorities are very good and working on it, and others are just ignoring it, is what is coming back. I was at a landlord registration review meeting last week with representatives of local authorities, and that was what was coming from them themselves on what's happening with it. You've got tenancy deposit protection that came in a year past November, and again we know that there is a lot of compliance, but we know that there's a lot of tricks being looked at to try to get around it, and there's no real evidence of anyone tackling that issue at the moment. So, with the caveat that legislation does actually need to seem to be enforced, yes, it could do an awful lot.
I wonder if I could come in here. Sorry, Jonathan. I think that the aim of what you're setting out to do is good, and speaking on behalf of the CLA, we welcome it. We welcome it absolutely, in order to give letting agents, the good letting agents, a better voice, if you like. That there are rogue agents out there. I think there are probably not as many as the public perceive, but this is going to help. I think there are two things, really. I think that the code of practice will be critical to this. What is in that code, and certainly we would be very keen to help draft that code and feed into it when we're looking at that stage. But also how it's enforced. That's very, very important, and we're all aware that enforcement has been a hot topic with landlord registration. It's very patchy throughout Scotland, and landlords are very dismissive of that legislation. I think I was very interested to hear Professor Duncan McClellan at a recent RICS conference, and his view is that really what we are lacking perhaps is a longer-term strategy for housing in Scotland. So I think that is something that perhaps needs to be looked at as part of this, that if we are seriously looking at good quality housing for the longer term, we need to be encouraging the private rented sector and not just looking to stamp down on bad practice. It has to be a mix of both. If I look at the fit and proper person test for letting agents, it's very negative. I would like to see some positive things coming out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, The bill covers a diverse range of initiatives across the social and private rented sectors, and we think that the key thing within that is the right of redress for people across those sectors. Those are the most important aspects of the bill that I see as positives. The RICS is the leading organisation of its kind in the UK, which is a bit of a plug for us, obviously, but what it means is that chartered surveyors are already qualified and regulated by their own self-regulating body to be letting agents. So, we have a good understanding within the RICS of what regulation means. Client, consumer and public protection is at the heart of everything that RICS Scotland does and is part of our professional standards, and our ethics are also part of that. The bill doesn't really include enough of that as we see it in terms of specifically relating to the private rented sector initiatives on letting agent registration. The vision of the government specifically in relation to the PRS is slightly different in that a private rented sector that provides good quality homes and high management standards, inspires consumer confidence and encourages growth through attracting increased investment is something that we really welcome as an aim, and we don't think the measures are quite strong enough. They could be adapted and amended through the process, but without proper enforcement and professional standards in the industry, then I think a list of things that you have to do it's not going to be self-enforcing by consumers, because there are many examples of where that doesn't work at the moment. So.
Thank you very much. Mr. Warren.
Thank you. Just picking up, and without repeating what's already been said, I'd prefer to pick up on the word that you've just said about the vision. I think that 2014 and leading into 2015 gives us a wonderful opportunity to have a vision to make the private rented sector something that hopefully in the years to come we'll look back on and say that in 2014, 2015 we got it right, and that this private rented sector sitting within the broader housing market operates well, has got a good supply chain leading into it, and is well managed and provided for in terms of the services. Now, the detail we're going to come to talk about, but as a vision, I think that we are in a wonderful place to make some real changes to make something that really works for the future.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, just add something.
One of the things that is mentioned quite often is how to improve the standards in the industry, and one of the most important things that would achieve that would be to bring more new properties, high quality properties in to compete with the existing stock. So much of the existing stock is old property, it has old heating systems, it's inefficient, doesn't meet much of the energy efficiency aims of the government, and new build properties are built to a much higher standard in terms of that side of things. And if there was a whole block of new flats built in each area that has a high rental demand, then that would do much more than anything else that's in this bill in terms of driving up standards, because people would have to compete with those houses and improve the standards in their property. The government's commissioned research that was presented before Christmas to building the rented sector, and a lot more focus should be put on that, but I think that's outside of the scope of this bill.
Just before you proceed, gentlemen and Madam, have you got any idea of what proportion of letting agents are covered by your various organisations, and how many letting agents still sit out with any of your sphere of influence, if you like?
Well, certainly for the CLA, we have just over 320 members at the moment. About 84 of those members have opted to sign up to an accreditation scheme as letting agents. That's Landlord Accreditation Scotland. I believe there are 155, Ian would be able to correct me, Arla members in Scotland. And in terms of...
We're a relatively new organisation, having been formed in the middle of last year. We currently have about 50 members. But in answer to your question, I think that there's probably about 30%, maybe 40% of agents around Scotland who probably are not actually part of groups like us.
40% represents how many?
I think the key question to it is the definition of an agent. Because are you speaking about somebody who's operating on the high street? Are you speaking about somebody that's operating on the internet? Or are you speaking about Uncle Tom Cobley who's acting for his Auntie Mary? Because in our opinion, that the latter example is often where the worst of the problems are, where someone is acting purely for half a dozen landlords, very often members of their own family. They have absolutely no knowledge of the law that they're operating within and do what they want. And that's where the consumer gets the worst experience. It's often where the worst quality of property is as well.
And how many hundreds and thousands or thousands do you think of those there are?
If we look at where other jurisdictions have started to try to identify agents through legislation, I could give the London Borough of Newham as an example. They have now discovered, 15 months into their licensing of all agents scheme, that they have nearly 3 times as many agents operating in their borough than they thought they had. They thought they had about 3,500 to 4,000 landlords owning about 25,000 to 30,000 properties. They now know they've got in excess of 10,000 landlords operating 38,000 properties. So one of the achievements of bringing in something like this is actually identifying an accurate picture of the size of the market. And I don't think any of us, we're all using best guesses. And I think, having worked with the civil servants working around this as well, we've always been, and they would accept, we've been guessing at how big the market is.
Can you explain a bit more how Newham have gone about this? Have they virtually gone to every single property? And
they marketed a requirement, I use the word marketed advisedly. They created the legislation that they had the power to do under the English Act of 2004. And they created a licensing scheme. They advertised that from the 1st of January 2013 that all landlords had to be registered with that. And they also required all agents to be registered with it. And they have been seen to be out there knocking on the doors. They've been looking at their LHA payment records. Is benefit being paid to a tenant in a property that's not registered to a landlord through the register? Is the agent who's dealing with the property and quite often shown on a tenancy agreement that would have been taken in for an LHA claim shown on the record? So there's been lots of joined-up thinking and practicalities in identifying it and making it happen. They're now at the stage that they're looking at active prosecution for where people have still not registered where they should have been registered. It's a similar setup that the Welsh Government is looking at. The Welsh Assembly Government are currently putting a bill in some ways not dissimilar to what the Scottish Government are doing at the moment. And I was at an evidence session there last week, and exactly the same kind of issues are coming up there, that they have started, in the meantime, in anticipation of the Act, trying to identify landlords, trying to identify agents, and their numbers are just exponentially going up.
Yes, Mr. Gordon.
So just in terms of the numbers of things, I think there's a lot of information, so it's hard to know how much of it you've seen, but there's around about 12% of households are in the private rented sector at the moment, which has doubled in the last number of years, and it's expected to rise again to 20% over the next few years, which is estimated by Shelter. There's about half of these are managed by letting agents, and about 1,000 letting agents in Scotland is what we're guessing, but it's really hard to tell because there are so many individuals managing 5 or 10 properties, starting off with their friends and then moving on. And we think the biggest problem which would need some adaptation of the bill to cover it is that there might be 40% of people that are members of bodies, but there's only 150 of those are actually regulated in any way. So the RICS and ARLA provide a regulation scheme for licensed members, and that leads to client money protection for their clients. It leads to professional standards and training, and all the benefits that come with that. And although only a small number of letting agents might be rogue letting agents, as we call them, some of those are very large, well-known firms. And Mr. Harvey mentioned one example in a committee hearing earlier, where he said a well-known, large and very professional firm is trying to get around the tenant deposit scheme. Well, we would say A very professional firm wouldn't do that, so they're not professional. So, you know, an RICS member, and I would assume an Arla licensed member, would not be trying to flout the law. They would be trying to comply with it as best they can and work within the spirit of the law, and not employing advocates to try and find wee nuances which would allow you to still charge a fee. So it's the professional standards, I think, is one of the key things that is important in an industry like this, because consumers cannot be relied on to understand the market themselves, and it needs to be laid out more clearly for them.
Okay, it's a very interesting range of answers we got there, and I'm sure my colleagues will explore the issues that you've raised there. Just one final question I've got is, do you have any observations on the consultation process that this bill has been associated with? Are you quite happy with the way you've been consulted?
I'm sitting nodding my head, so I might as well say yes. I am happy that it has been consulted on. I think there's still, obviously, once the bill becomes an act, there'll be a lot of consultation work required around the secondary legislation and all the impact of it. And I think we would all welcome the opportunity to contribute to that, and we all do believe we have something to contribute to that.
I feel the consultation process was good. It's a fairly standard process, I believe, in Scottish Government. I think that the difficulty is that, you know, people are time short, and they don't actually make it a priority to respond, and that's a weakness. And that's nothing to do with the Scottish Government. It's really down to, you could say, apathy. What I would like to see, I think, is what happened with the tenancy reform proposals, where I believe you had tasked somebody to set up focus groups throughout the country. So that, again, would be another avenue for gathering information and responses.
Okay. And
I sit on the tenancy review group, which I think Catherine was referring to, and I think the key stakeholders that are sitting there are the right people to look at that. And the same stakeholders were involved in this process. There is, as Catherine said, there's been very good research within that of the real stakeholders, if you like, the tenants and landlords out in the field, and some qualitative data which has come out with some very interesting results in relation to that group. But in terms of the consultation process with the RICS and other bodies, the Scottish Government consulted with us before publishing the bill on 3 options. And in terms of the options, the first option is something that nobody was really keen on, which is expanding the landlord registration scheme. The option 2, which was chosen, is obviously in the Act and is clear. Option 3 would be a legal obligation that all agents must be a member of a recognised professional body, and it is assumed that legislation would establish in law how that body or bodies would regulate their members. The Scottish Government ministers instructed officials to pursue option 2, and whilst we recognise this as a step in the right direction, we think it falls short of the more consistent and targeted regulation of option 3 for some of the reasons that I've mentioned already. And we would like to see, we think option 2 could be amended to get as close as possible to option 3, which would be...
I think we'll come on to that again in more detail. But in general, in terms of the consultation, you know, you were able to put forward your views, and you're fairly satisfied with that. Okay. Part 4 of the bill has 2 main aims, according to the Scottish Government. The first is to promote high standards of service and levels of professionalism across the country. And the second is to provide landlords and tenants with easy access to a mechanism that will help to resolve disputes where these arise. So we've kind of broached the subject already in the introduction, but do you agree, first of all, with the Scottish Government that there is evidence of poor practice, and, you know, can you expand a bit more than you did in your introductory remarks about how we managed to promote a higher service across the country, even among your members, but also trying to get these other people to the level that they realise that they must register? Yes, Mr. Porter.
I think for me, education is key to it. At the moment, anybody can be a letting agent today. They don't need a high street premise, they don't need any training. They can merely advertise for landlords to give them their property, and they don't need to know what they're doing. And generally speaking, that is part of the problem. The other part of the problem is the lack of knowledge on a landlord's part. And certainly when I was operating as an agent in the west of Scotland, one of the things that I spent a lot of my time doing was actually explaining to my landlord clients what they could and what they couldn't do. It would be fairly typical for a tenancy agreement, for example, to say that once rent is 14 days late, that the landlord would start to take action. The landlord thinks that that means after 14 days they can come along and change the locks and the tenant is gone. In fact, we all know that that is not what can happen in a practical situation. There's a legal process that has to be gone through. And tenants are similarly uneducated in lots of ways. They don't read tenancy agreements. There's plenty of evidence of that. Student market is a brilliant example of it, that they don't understand or have properly explained to them things like joint and several liability. Guarantors, the guarantors don't understand what they're signing for. And that would be typical in that marketplace. And so I think clear, simple language guidance is what's needed. But at the moment, we have virtually 100 pieces of legislation that impact on a letting agent in one way or another, either consumer law or lettings law or housing and property law. So there is an awful lot of primary legislation and secondary legislation that impacts on the sector. And one of the things that we are doing, in actual fact, whilst the ethos behind it has to be acknowledged, we've had several new housing acts in Scotland over the last few years anyway, all of which bits of impact on the private rented sector. And we're getting it more and more different places to go and understand what piece of legislation impacts on another, what supersedes something else. And one of the things for me would be a long-term objective for the government would be a consolidation bill.
I think that support what Ian's just been saying, but in addition, I think that the education of tenants, landlords, letting agents as the main stakeholders, that the education of all of those elements has got to be brought up at the same time. I see a differential between, as Ian was saying, what landlords and the regulations and how they behave, and a letting agent. And as a letting agent regulation comes through, it's really important, I think, that the landlords are similarly encouraged to come up to similar standards. So it all comes back to education.
Yes.
I would agree with Ian and with Malcolm. I think education is key. And as you know, I represent the Council of Letting Agents. I work very closely with a group of fantastically dedicated people in a steering group, and what we are about is what our members want to see, which is raising of standards so that letting agents are respected. We are giving freely of our very limited precious time because we feel this matters. We feel it matters very much. We're a division of the Scottish Association of Landlords. SAL has its own complaints process. We are working on a complaints process for the CLA. That, I think, is very important. In terms of education, we are working very closely with Elspeth Boyle at Landlord Accreditation Scotland. We're looking at providing more training modules for letting agent members. We're looking at this training being something that will be ongoing, and it will be tailored to what letting agents are wanting. We may decide as a body that we are going to insist on CPD compulsory professional development, continuing professional development for our members. Speaking for myself, we as a small family firm happen to have chosen to be members of the RICS, ARLA, CLA, Landlord Accreditation Scotland and Safe Agent. And very often these things mean nothing to the man in the street. So it's not just about educating the letting agents, it's, I think, about educating tenants and landlords as to why they should choose to use a member of a particular body. And I think that's very, very important.
I think I'd agree with you that education is key. I wouldn't agree with you, Mr Potter, that students don't know. In fact, my student children have been telling me what I should be doing with my landlord, but because student associations are very keen on making sure that students at their university know their rights and responsibilities in terms of renting properties.
NUS themselves, Madam Chairman, do in fact say that their members do not read as much as they should do. They perhaps do research once they've got a problem, and I wouldn't disagree with that statement, but it's actually avoiding the problem in the first place that should be, or not being faced with the problem. If we can eradicate the problem in the first place, then that helps. Just to add to what Kathleen was saying there, we do have a formally regulated qualification for letting agents, and that's and we are an awarding body that is regulated by the statutory body in that area, and have been for several years now, and that is the only route that we take new members in by. They have to be qualified.
And how many, is there a queue to join then and to do this course?
There's a lot of people are studying that don't necessarily come and join us. We wish they would, but what we are doing, in Scotland last year, we had over 500 people passed the technical award in residential lettings in Scotland.
So do you think the regulations should include that people must have done this course or a similar one?
I think that's what I was getting at by saying that they need to be educated, and it points them. It doesn't tell them everything, nothing ever will, but what it does do is make you more aware of key problems and where to go and how to solve that problem to get the advice.
Okay, Mr Gordon and then Ms Gill.
Yeah, I think it's moved slightly off topic into the type of tenancy that they're dealing with and the misunderstandings within that. The Tenancy Review Group is looking closely and is at simplifying the current tenancy regime so that people have a better chance to understand it. So, just very briefly, tenants have to sign up to 8 pieces of paperwork with a letting agent, and our experience is in taking over properties from other letting agents that we rarely get all the pieces of paperwork. So people haven't issued the TIP, the tenant information pack, or the prescribed information for the tenancy deposit scheme, and it really comes down to training. So that is very relevant here. So most letting agents are not trying to break the law. Most letting agents are not trying to get round current legislation, and we need to enforce that on the ones that are doing that. But it's really about lack of knowledge. So there are so many letting agents in each town and city that it's really hard for anybody to be able to choose which one the best is. There's no real competition because nobody understands what a letting agent should and shouldn't do and how to judge that. But if we go back to the actual registration scheme, the RICS has got some recent evidence that registration schemes in themselves do not improve standards. I think you have to start with a list of who's fit and proper. But the people who are not fit and proper know they're not fit and proper and will not apply and stay under the radar. So you need to have something that hunts those people out. The Property Factors Act is only a year and a half old, and I believe that although it's not going to match it exactly, the registration scheme is intended to be similar to that. And the RICS carried out an impact review report on the Property Factors Act last year and is currently in dialogue with the Scottish Government on its findings. So the registration scheme has some issues that factors themselves think is not working. And I've got some three key things that came out from that in the review. The compulsory registration of property factors has not stopped rogue factors from operating. This is because the necessary qualifications for registering as a property factor are too low and simplistic. Some property factors with a history of malpractice are now seeing themselves as being legitimised to practice, and accordingly a more robust registration process system would help, comprising details beyond basic personal and company details, to try and explore who's registering a bit further. One of the key dangers or risks of the legislation as it sits at the moment for registration is that even within the evidence from the committee, people keep saying, what about this part of the regulation and what about this part of the registration? So regulation doesn't happen unless you have enforcement. You need to have a code of practice, a list of people that are fit and proper, a redress system, but you need to have some professional standards and some enforcement. You really need to have a professional body that's overseeing what happens and making judgments on whether people are complying with the code of practice. We operate as a factor in a very small degree. We factor one block of rented flats as well as renting out the flats, and we obviously had to register for the property factor scheme, and we read a number, this is anecdotal, but we read a number of other people's written statements of services based on complying with the Act, and we found that they were misrepresenting the Code of Conduct within their own written statement of services in order to comply with the Code of Conduct. So how anybody is supposed to be able to unravel all that themselves as a consumer is just, it's just not going to work.
Okay. Alex, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah,
please,
thank you. This is where we go back to the point in the earlier conversation where you were stopped because the question was coming later. I'd like to hear your general views on the model of regulation proposed by the Scottish Government, but particularly how you think it compares with the other potential options that existed.
So, as I said, the RICS thinks that it would be better to have a single professional body that's regulating it. So the best example is that the RICS is established by Royal Charter. It's a self-regulation model, and their members are heavily regulated, and that is enforced. There's a CPD requirement to do 20 hours of professional development each year, and people have to comply with that. That doesn't mean that people can't make it up, but it just means that the standards are there to be enforced by the body. And we've had auditors in our office checking that we manage our client accounts properly, and they found when we first started there are very specific ways you have to manage a client account. You mustn't let any one person's ledger go into a negative balance, otherwise if you go bust, their money has to come from somewhere else. Now, unless somebody's checking that and making sure that people understand that, then there's no point in having a code of conduct that has a requirement to have a client account, because having a client account still means that if you're going to go bust as a company, or you're already engaging in malpractice and causing trouble for your clients, if you see that everything's going to blow up in your face, then you can easily move all the money out of your client account, and then the clients wouldn't be able to get their money back when that company goes bust. The benefit of having a professional body involved with standards and training and enforcement is that you can then have client money protection, which is impossible to have without enforced regulation. You can buy various insurance policies for this, but it wouldn't cover the same. It's like a big fail-safe. It's like if you put £50,000 in the bank with RBS, you don't know what's going to happen with RBS, but you know that the government will give you your money back. And that doesn't, RBS could have been let go bust, and one of the reasons the government might have protected it is so they didn't have to give all the depositors their money back. So you need that basic level of client money protection backed up by a professional body, and I think that's the key thing that has to be brought into the three key things are there, but just missing one final piece of the puzzle.
Could I come in there? I have a fear that perhaps that route actually is somewhat exclusive. I think that there is a route by which registration can be strengthened, which actually invites all registered letting agents to carry out the requirements that would be needed if you're going to be a member of ARLA or RICS, which actually includes things like professional indemnity, client bank accounts, annual audit of those client bank accounts, and ensuring that all this kind of certification takes place on an annual basis not 3 yearly as proposed under the property factors and what is proposed at the moment. So that what a letting agent will be required to do is to, on an annual basis, provide online a legal confirmation that they are carrying out each of those activities. And I think that something along those lines could be explored in detail in order to achieve a point at which a wish for everybody to be properly qualified is an aim, but not something that actually is achieved today.
I want you to get into a bun fight of which, which body's better than the other, but Ms Gell and then Mr Gordon.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to take issue with Malcolm and to make it very clear that a client bank account is a very different thing to client money protection. You may or may not be aware that there are at present bodies out there, brokers, who will offer client money protection to firms who are acting as letting agents who are not members of professional bodies such as Arla or RICS, who actually do have a requirement for that. And part of that, and this is something that we are tossing around within the CLA, whether this is something that we want to look at asking our members to move towards. One of the requirements, if you have CMP through these bodies, is that you also have to buy into professional indemnity insurance. Sorry, it is professional indemnity insurance, that's right. And you must also be signed up with one of the 2 ombudsman services. And it's, I've looked at it, I've spoken to Simon Morris from Ombudsman Services Property, and it's actually not hugely expensive. And that would, in a sense, be quite self-regulating, in my view.
Mr Gordon.
I think a bun fight wouldn't hopefully happen, but the real reason that wouldn't happen is that the 4 witnesses today are all being regulated at the moment. So the RICS regulates my company, and Kathleen's husband was my predecessor, so they're also regulated by the RICS. Obviously, Arla are a regulation body, and Malcolm's a member of Arla. So there's no real argument over the whole principles of that. I think the key is how do you get something that is cost effective for letting agents. But we must remember that if a letting agent is carrying out their business in a poor fashion, and there is poor practice within the way that they operate, and that is affecting landlords and tenants and their homes that they live in or their investments, then it's essential that somebody is making checks on things that are happening with that. So I think Malcolm's idea of having a self-audit, if you like, is a good idea. But if nobody's checking that, then I think it still won't work, because there are different types of client account. So it's often quoted that you need to have a non-designated client account or a designated client account. Does anybody know what that means? Well, I didn't until I got one, and then I was told with RICS what it had to look like. Now, there's different types of professional indemnity insurance. When I got a quote for my professional indemnity insurance this year, it's a key thing, because it's the ultimate backstop of ruining that landlord's investment. It is possible to sign a lease in the wrong way that ties them in forever, so the tenant never has to leave in the way that some people would like it to be, perhaps. And that might not be a bad thing in some ways, but the important thing is that at the moment the legislation is very complex, and you need to do things in a particular way. It's not a simple process. And my professional indemnity insurance came back with a different date for the retroactive date, which would not have covered us beyond a certain date, and that's why it was cheaper. So I had to obviously adjust that, because the RICS tell me that that's what I need to do, is that my retroactive date must go all the way back. I hardly even know what retroactive means, but RICS, I have to fill in a thing and it says, is it retroactive? I then have to look it up and see that it says it's retroactive, so fully retroactive. So nobody's going to understand that.
I'm very keen to hear what Ian Potter has to say on this, but it is very clear that the Scottish Government hold the opinion that requiring letting agents to be a member of a recognised trade or professional body would amount to self-regulation and by the industry, and would lead to smaller letting agents being forced out of the market. How do we reconcile these two things?
I don't think that would happen at all, to be perfectly honest. I do have a huge concern about self-certification of compliance, because we, like RICS, have a compliance regime, and the quality of what comes in where people think they are complying leaves a lot to be desired, and that's agents who are trying to comply. And we have to work with them to ensure that they've got full compliance. They let their PI run out. They forget to renew it. They open a new bank account and don't get it designated as a client bank account. The audit on an annual basis picks that up, but on a self-certification scheme, would they actually be aware of it? Very often the agent will actually come back to us and say, it's the bank that's made a mistake. We asked the bank, and they'll provide evidence that they asked for a designated client account. And that's not what they've been given by the financial institution. So that's where you do need the audit. Otherwise, you break away all the protection that we've been speaking about. We've actually got another problem with client bank accounts at the moment. I don't know whether it's one that's come across your radar. I only came across it recently in a meeting with the successor to the Financial Services Authority. And that is that banks are probably breaking anti-money laundering regulations by allowing an agent to open a designated client bank account, because the query is what due diligence was done on the client who is the ultimate beneficial owner of those funds. And there's a whole piece of work going on to ensure that we can get regulation down that route. And that would actually mean agents having to do an awful lot more work on due diligence of their client that's not currently covered under the money laundering regulation directive. Letting agents are not covered under that at the moment. An estate agent is, but a letting agent's not. So you can actually go into one shop, for want of a better expression, and half the business is regulated under some legislation, and the other half isn't. And, you know, that doesn't help the consumer either. I think one of the key things for me in the proposals here and looking at the impact, dispute resolution between the agent and the client going through PRHP is very expensive. If you look at the evidence of the Ombudsman schemes that currently operate for Jonathan's members and my members, it is far cheaper to operate. The majority of the complaints that come from the consumer are very easily fixed, because in actual fact, that's where the evidence about lack of education comes from. Tenant complains that they've been given notice that they need to leave their property. Well, their tenancy has actually come to an end, and the landlord's legally bringing it to an end through the agent. But they're not happy, they don't want to leave, so they go to the Ombudsman and make a complaint. If you're taking that through the PRHP route, and the figures that are quoted there are suggesting probably £1,600, £1,700, £1,800 for that to be looked at, it's disproportionate to the problem. What the consumer needs to be advised is there is the issue. There are people who take negatives out of the rise in complaints that have gone to Ombudsman schemes over the last few years. I think it's a very positive thing that the number of complaints that have gone to the Ombudsman schemes that agents have signed up to on a voluntary basis for lettings, for the simple reason that it is showing and it is providing evidence that the consumer is starting to understand that there is a route, there is somewhere to go, that there previously wasn't. Also, the number of agents that have signed up to the existing Ombudsman schemes has grown exponentially since 2006. So you would expect, anyway, the number of complaints to go. I think when this legislation comes forward, whichever body is looking at complaints against a letting agent has to be prepared to accept that the figures that are in the impact papers provided for this are holding the finger into the wind to see what way it's blowing, because I think the figures will turn out to be much, much higher. It's the better agent who's trying to do it right that has signed up to these schemes on a voluntary basis. When we start to bring in the rest, which I do believe we should be doing, we have to be prepared to see numbers going up. But that's what consumer protection is about.
Can I add to that? I think you might ask another question about the redress system itself, which I would have some comments on. But if you're talking about the specifics of the letting agents going bust, which I think was your last point, or out of business if there's too much enforced upon them.
Yep.
So option 3 really was that, and we felt as a body, or the RICS, I wasn't actually in the stakeholder groups myself. It was someone from our policy team, but there was a genuine feeling that there was a that option 3 was the preferred option within the group, and the key thing that I think stopped that was this thing about small agents not being able to afford the training and accreditation. Now, you know, the government was concerned that these small agents can't afford the training and accreditation will go out of business, but ultimately it is the nature of any well-regulated market that there must be some basic entry requirements. I don't think most letting agents would go bust, or even a significant number of them. If agents are not qualified to operate in the market and can't afford the cost of training, you're not going to improve standards or provide basic protection for their customers, and they should leave the market. So for the bill to realise its desired policy outcomes in terms of raising professional standards and reducing consumer detriment, it is vital that there's consistent and effective approaches to enforcement of the proposed arrangements and the associated code of practice. A recent RICS impact research paper, which we can make available to the committee, suggests, in short, that some summary figures suggest that the benefits will outweigh the costs in less than 2.5 years. Now, these are high-level research findings in terms of the cost to society and so on. But, you know, we have to remember what we're dealing with. These are tenants' homes that are needing protection. These are tenants that cannot get what they need from their letting agent or indeed their landlord. And it's quite a big study that's going into the Tenancy Review Group that's been mentioned a couple of times, which is reporting soon. And they commissioned research which the government paid for, which was qualitative. It interviewed local tenants in small towns like Dumfries and Inverness and all over the countryside to gather views on what they felt about how well the tenancy regime was working for them, whether they understood the lease that they signed, whether they wanted a longer tenancy, like some people are advocating, or more security of tenure. But what the research actually fed back in was that they didn't really care about that. So very few people understood exactly what was happening from either the landlord or the tenant in terms of the tenancy regime. But the comments that came back from, as a consensus from the tenants was very kind of distressing to the group in terms of what it produced. And it's the first research that I've seen, so I would recommend that everyone gets a copy of it, because it's really saying that there are people sitting there with a boiler that doesn't work. They can't heat the water to have a bath for their children. These are the vulnerable tenants at the bottom of the ladder in terms of their ability. We tend to manage properties which are in the centre of town. They're let out to professional working people or sometimes students who have guarantors that are professional working people. They can move. We've had landlords who refused to do a repair that we've given up. And, you know, in trying to get that sorted and make it happen, we've had to tell the tenants' parents that they're not meeting the repairing standard, we'll give up the property, but here's how you need to resolve it by going to the repairing standard with the private rented housing panel. But, you know, these people can move, so that property they actually just left. The parents told the tenants to just leave, we'll not pay the next month's rent, he's not fixing it, and actually they never came back to them. They moved into another property that was more suitable. But the people that who are living in some of the more deprived areas, who are more vulnerable, they do not have the ability to leave and demand their rights. They don't feel that they're empowered to act, and it's those people that need to be protected. And letting agents is not a simple process. They're looking after complex obligations, and there are letting agents that will allow landlords to manage their own maintenance. Whether that's being done poorly or well is the question. And there are letting agents out there who will allow landlords to not meet the repairing standard but still collect the rent and pass it on for them and sign the lease. And that's not going to disappear with a registration scheme. I think it just needs a bit more enforcement to get in and create more compliance with even existing legislation.
Thank you.
Right, we need to move on, Mary.
Section 26 to 52 of the bill sets out the detail of how the regulatory regime would work. So I'd be interested in the panel's views on the proposals for the registration of letting agents, the definition of letting agents, the fit and proper person test, and the requirement for agents to re-register every 3 years. And I note from Mr Warwick from Let Scotland, your view is that it should be an annual renewal. So perhaps in your answer you could explain a bit more about why you think it should be annual, but I'm interested in the panel's views on all of that.
We've touched on the weaknesses of the property factors aspect, and I think that as we look forwards to the pivotal role that letting agents are going to have in the housing market over the next 5 to 10 years, it's essential that the controls on them, and whether or not those controls are from government overseeing the certification of auditing and all this kind of detail that my colleagues have just been talking about, or whether or not it's by RICS. To leave something over a 3-year period to not be tested properly, I think is too long. And that's why I think that whatever the detail is that it actually is embarked in stage 2, in order to actually determine the fine detail of the letting agent registration, I almost think of it in terms, actually a word that's been in my mind about this is actually a licence. I'm not so sure that in fact letting agents shouldn't actually have an annual licence to operate. And if we think of it in licensing terms, and that they've actually got to provide certification to demonstrate that they have these things that we've been talking about, you know, the right professional indemnity, the correct client bank account, the correct audit that's been carried out of that client bank account. There are other things as well. The list is actually quite long, so I don't want to go into the whole list other than just to say that as we go through stage 2 consultation, I think that this kind of detail, as ever, the devil is in the detail, and this is actually legislation that is actually going to hopefully provide an excellent example of what being part of a wider housing market can be in the years to come. In 5 or 10 years' time, I'd like us to be looking back and saying this is something that is actually envied by the world. People refer to the US and the way their private rented sector, the Europe, and I'd like to think that we can cherry pick the best elements out of what happens in the global private rented sector, bring it in here and make sure that we actually get something that works and works for the long term.
Just before I move on to the other panel members, and I absolutely agree that the devil is in the detail, and I'm sure we'll get more detail as we go along. But in relation to the fit and proper person, what would you like to see, or what do you think should be a requirement to become a fit and proper person?
Ideally, a professional qualification should be there.
If you want to think about it and come
I think
back.
I'll have to think about it.
Yeah.
It's sort of kind of, you know, okay. I'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone? Yeah. Yes.
I would like to comment on the fit and proper person consideration as it's set out in the bill. I think I said earlier, I feel it's coming across in a very negative way. It's not particularly helpful. It's not setting a minimum standard, and I think, you know, that's certainly what we are wanting to see at the CLA, that there is a minimum threshold for a letting agent to operate. Now, at the moment, in terms of qualifications and so on, I have to say it's a little patchy. What is out there in Scotland is a little patchy. I know in England that I believe one of the London universities is looking at offering a degree specialising in residential property management. In Scotland at the moment, the highest level that somebody who wants to develop their career path in the PRS can reach is a level 3 certificate, which is equivalent to a Scottish higher. It's not possible for an Ireland member to go beyond that in Scotland. Certainly there are training opportunities and excellent ones afforded by Elspeth Boyle through Landlord Accreditation Scotland. But it might be that the Scottish Government could look at perhaps putting some funding into bodies. It's not for me to say this, but there are bodies out there. There's the Chartered Institute of Housing, there's Landlord Accreditation Scotland, and it would be good to feel that the Scottish Government was helping letting agents to meet a minimum standard of competence. We need to think too about the future. If we look at the age profile of letting agents in Scotland, it's likely that the average age of most of us is not certainly in our 20s. So we need to be looking at developing career paths for people and giving them the ability to become qualified and even better qualified. And let us set the standard in Scotland. Please let us do that.
And what's your view on 3 years, every 3 years?
I agree with Malcolm. I think that's far too long. I think it's far too long. I think let's just get in there and let's have this checked every year on an annual basis. Lots can happen in a 3-year period.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Potter, yeah.
Okay. I think there's a halfway house on the 3-year period. I don't see any issues around a 3-year licence. I think the issue is around what checking is being carried out during that period of licence. And the suggestion of annual documentation is a practical way round it. That one concern that I have from practical experience of looking at the documentation myself is who is going to look at the issues around client accounts. For example, we have succeeded in having registered auditors, chartered accountants, struck off for false declarations on behalf of members. So that whoever's looking at it, whether it's the Scottish Government or whether it's bodies such as ourselves, it's how robust can they be? For me, it is really the key. Jonathan mentioned the professional indemnity insurance and the retroactive cover. That's hugely important because you could have made the mistake 2 years ago, changed your insurer, and if you don't have that retroactive cover, when the problem comes to light, there's no insurance in place. Your current policy would not cover you. It's where things like motor insurance, where people are generally comfortable of what it covers, that if you change your insurer and say, I had an accident 3 months ago, and you've changed your insurer, they're going to say, well, you didn't tell us, so tough.
I would echo all of that. I think you were asking specifically about the registration scheme, the fit and proper test. So my understanding of the fit and proper test, as it stands at the moment for landlord registration, the Property Factors Bill, is that it checks various high-level details about criminal activity and that type of thing. It is important to know who the letting agents are, to have a list of them, and that certain types of people should not be allowed to operate. So I think the register is a key starting point for that. With all the evidence I've given so far, my comment would be that the requirement to be a fit and proper person would be to a member of a professional body that regulates your activities and protects the public from what you do. You just have to keep going back to what we're doing. So, you know, there's been a lot of research done about the problems in the sector, complaints about landlords and letting agents, and then it's very common for surveys to show that 79% of tenants say they're satisfied with their agent. And you know, that is quoted on letting agents' websites as being a key reason for no requirement to legislate in terms of letting agents. Well, there's 300,000 properties, so that could be 60,000 households living in badly repaired homes without boilers at work, with mould in the bedroom that's not being repaired. It's a huge volume of people's homes, and it's a growing sector. And to have untrained people, so I'm representing the RICS view, but obviously as a letting agent that's regulated, I have other comments to make. And one of the ones would be that any time that we take over properties from other agents, or we quite often have to go as a company to meet or to try and get access to a property above ours where there's been a leak into our property. And we quite often meet people from other letting agents there. And the standard of knowledge with the people that we meet in well-known companies that are on the high street is poor. There is no training of their members. There is a lack of knowledge around all the legislation, the documents that are required, and how to deal even with simple maintenance problems. So if you remove all the things about tenants' rights and landlord rights and everything else, meant to be managing a property, and we go in to inspect it every 3 or 6 months, depending on the type of property, and you know, what do those inspections involve? So a landlord would expect you to be looking at the property, assessing what's happening in the property in terms of the tenant, but also looking whether there's any maintenance required, something's going to fall down, whether the tiles are coming off the wall and the grout's cracking, and that could be a £2,000 repair. If you catch it now, you just have to regrout it. That's the kind of thing that we look at as a proper organisation that is managing property. And if you go back to the training thing, it is key within that. But in terms of the highest standards, I wouldn't suggest that everybody should be a chartered surveyor, although that would be good for us. But you know, I studied for 7 years learning how to manage property, structural surveying, all that type of thing. And that's the type of people that should be managing properties, or at least running the companies that are doing it. But you can build yourself up through qualifications that Catherine mentioned to get quite close to that within the level 3. I think it's slightly more. It's covering a very narrow area, which is why you might compare it to a higher. But I think that's okay. If every member of staff that works for a letting agent had that, then half of your problems would disappear.
Okay, thank you. Mr Potter, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I think you alluded to something that we've started to find really quite interesting as well, which is the business models of agency and who should be satisfying that fit and proper person test. There are plenty of examples of agencies where the shareholders and the board are not anywhere near the day-to-day running of the business. But the person who would be left, or likely to be left, with the fit and proper person test would be the office manager or the business manager or the lettings manager, who in practice cannot always, to keep their own job, comply with what they should be doing if the business owner is in fact telling them to do something different. And I think we need to just address that. The route that Wales are suggesting to get round that particular problem is they're looking at fit and proper person test, as defined by the HMO legislation, for the principals, partners and directors of the business, along with an educational qualification at that level, as well as an educational qualification in 2/3 of all staff working customer-facing. And they are looking at a level 2, level 3 qualification for that. It is a minimum level, but that in itself is perceived, and we do very much support that ethos, that it would start to raise the standards. We've got to set the bar somewhere that's achievable to begin with, and we can crank it up later on once we've started to get the mass that people were concerned about, the smaller businesses, would it impact on the smaller businesses? They can achieve at a lower level to begin with. They can start to see the business benefit of that, and will be able to achieve a higher level. So I don't think a low-level bar to begin with is a bad thing, as long as there is a planned strategy to achieve a higher-level bar.
Can I add to that? I think in dealing with the smaller letting agent, so we've got 6 staff members that are letting agents that have got, 10,000 properties. There's huge scales, and the regulation within any professional body tends to deal with that quite well. So you can have very low. So you can become a member of the RICS by going through the ASOC process, which is fairly straightforward. You have to prove your competence. You might have to do training depending on which route you go through. But it could be if you've worked in the letting industry for 10 years or 5 years, you might actually be able to get a direct route in, but then you'd have to continue doing professional development after that. But you'd also have to understand your professional standards and your ethics, and there's basic tests for those before you come in. So, there are routes already for people to become chartered surveyors who haven't done a degree like I have, which I might be slightly jealous of that approach, but that would be a good approach because it brings everybody up towards the right standard. And I think, the other thing I was going to say is just a repetition of what Ian said, so I think that's
Okay, Ms Gill, did you want to come back
Yeah,
in for
I query, please, are you aware of, or are you thinking, in fact, of how you might capture the agents in south of the border who are perhaps acting as agents and managing properties in Scotland? They never go near those properties. They are in a shocking state of repair, I have to say. And I just wonder, you know, have you given thought to that? Because they are out there.
Yeah, I mean,
we get calls from them quite frequently.
Yeah, I mean, it is
us.
something that,
Yes.
that we are aware of, but thank you for pointing that out. Can I move on to the Code of Practice? Because the bill makes provisions for a letting agent Code of Practice, and I know that many letting agents already comply with existing professional codes of practice. So could the panel members give me a bit more information around what's in the existing codes of practice, but more importantly, how they're enforced if there's a breach?
I think it's really Jonathan and I whose bodies have codes of practice and requirements. We effectively have two bits to our code of practice. We require all our members to belong to one of the two ombudsman schemes that were created under the Consumer and Estate Agency Redress Act for sales agents, who will also cover lettings complaints. And the Property Ombudsman Service did develop a code of practice, and that was based on a code of practice that Arla had previously developed, and they got to the OFT Stage 1 approval of that as a code of practice. And that covers many of the wider issues around what the consumer should have experienced, and it also offers redress to the consumer if financial recompense is looked for, both a landlord or a tenant, for actions that materially impacted on the consumer. To complement that, we then have a disciplinary process. And if we receive a complaint that is not just looking for redress, we take that complaint through the process, and the punishments under that can be anything from a warning, a requirement to go and do further training, to expulsion of membership. And we do last year, from nationally within the UK, we removed 270 members for non-compliance. So we do actually act on it. The problem is that because it is a voluntary self-regulatory scheme, that does not stop these people from practising. And there is no route for letting agents at all in any of the UK jurisdictions to ban them from being a letting agent.
So you can expel them, but they can just carry on?
And that is in practice what happens, unless they have totally gone bust and disappeared with all their clients' funds. And we had one like that last year that has created the Phoenix, risen again, and is doing exactly the same, belonging to nobody at all, so there is no consumer protection. And that's the loop that we need to make sure it is complete to stop it from happening.
There's some evidence from well, there's lots of evidence from work done by people like the Property Ombudsman, but also the RIC itself. Now, the RICs haven't formulated our views on what the Code of Conduct should be, but that, we understand, is going to be part of the next another consultation. But we've got, you know, the RIC has a significant experience of direct relation of its own members. I brought the, I think if you compare us to Arla, the only difference would be that, well, actually there are lots of differences, but, but in terms of the actual regulation of its members, the key thing is the client money protection thing, but what you need to have to achieve that. And so Arla licensed members, which is when a principal is a member, you can be a member of Arla and I think work for a company, which means you've gone out and got the qualifications yourself, but your company necessarily isn't that. That was the kind of key difference I was going to say. If you're regulated by or a chartered surveyor, then you have to comply with the professional practice and codes of conduct. So the code of conduct is generally some basic high-level things, but it's the checking of that. So, you know, we have a list of things. I could actually leave the code of conduct with you. There's a code of conduct. The key things are the code of conduct, client money, advice for firms, and the professional indemnity insurance advice for firms, but then also the professional and ethical standards that we have to comply with. So the key things within that are the fact that you have to have a complaint handling procedure. So this helps to deal with low-level complaints, helps people to have a redress system that they can deal with themselves, that they understand, and it helps firms avoid statutory interference or having to go to an ombudsman. And it's very like the Financial Conduct Authority dealing with complaints about mortgages. So we would have 8 weeks in which to deal with the complaint actively. And if we're not dealing with it at all, then I think there's other redress mechanisms. But after that point, they can go to the ombudsman, and that would cost us a fee of £230. But it would cost the consumer nothing to do that. It's up to the ombudsman whether they would take the case on as a valid case. But if it's a valid case, then it would go through a procedure with appeals and everything else that goes with it. And the client money protection and professional indemnity insurance, I think, are the two other key things that just to illustrate the importance of them, they have separate documents that advise you of how to deal with that. And it's the compliance with those two things that then leads to the client money protections, that the ultimate protection for investors. The code of conduct, I think, deals more effectively with the landlord side of things, the investor, and we have to remember that most landlords are not they're not sophisticated investors. They happen to have a house that their parents owned, or they moved in with their partner and they're renting out the other one. Most landlords and most properties in the rented sector are not managed by institutions or owned by institutions, sorry. They're just individuals that it's maybe their pension pot for when they retire. They maybe have a mortgage that covers more than the cost than they actually get in rent. So it's important to them that things are managed properly by their agent, and it's you know, it's one of the, well, I think it might be the only normal consumer investment that isn't regulated in a properly enforced way at the moment. And so it's vital that this Act goes through, but it's also vital that it's amended slightly to make sure it's enforced in the same way that other investment products have enforcement behind the management of them.
Yeah, but if you could leave those details with us, it would be very useful.
Send us
Or
it
send us,
electronically.
yeah.
It would be,
It'd be
more
very
helpful.
useful. Yeah. And obviously the code of practice, it would raise the standards for tenants, but it would also, I would imagine, in your view, it will help to weed out the rogue landlords and rogue letting agents.
It has the potential to do that. I think what is not particularly robust in either of the codes, and I do say that despite the fact we signed off a new code yesterday at a board meeting, is around the standard of the property, which is a key issue, because that is covered under different legislation. And what both the codes, the RICS code and our own code has, is the requirement for the agent to act within the law. Yeah. So effectively there's a catch-all phrase in the code of practice to encapsulate that particular issue. But it is the property standard, which is some of the concern that's coming out here today and within the bill, is a difficult one for a code of practice to properly enshrine and have meaningful teeth when there is already legislation and, as I said earlier on, a body, i.e. the local authority, with statutory powers to deal with those issues. I think if the agent or the landlord was being found guilty of breaches of their statutory obligations, and we were getting that information back on one of our members, we would look at what we would take as disciplinary action on that. As a guidance, and I don't sit on the tribunals that would look at such cases, but if I could say that, and nor can the membership part of the body say what the regulation should be doing. Regulation has to be ring-fenced and independent. But typically, if it was one case, that the member might very well just get a warning, a formal warning, and told next time, you know, that's one strike, if you like. if you were seeing a repeated pattern of it, you would look at other means. And we recently amended our code of practice that we can fine up to 5 million.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to... it is actually probably missing from our code of conduct as well, other than it's part of your professional standards. So we give up landlords' properties and don't manage them if they won't comply with their repairing standard. So I think it would be a really good idea to actually have it. I hadn't thought of including it in the code of conduct for this. That you bind the letting agent to the landlord's obligations. So it's all anecdotal evidence in it, but it comes back to, so you take over a property from another letting agent and you look for the gas safety certificate, you find that it's 3 years out of date. And then you go back through the paperwork and you find that there's an email from the landlord saying to the letting agent, don't worry about it, I already know where the tenants are, I've spoken to the tenants, I've got keys, I'll deal with it directly myself. And then they don't, and then the landlord goes, that's fine. And then there's other ones where it is more common in London, but they have a rent collection only and legal service perhaps, where they find the tenant, move them in, but they don't manage the maintenance. And but when they're doing the viewings, they know fine well that the property is not in good condition. But you know, at the end of the day, they're going to get 10% of 500 quid for doing nothing. And I think binding them to the landlord's obligations, which are probably the most significant. I mean, there's lots of very significant landlord obligations, which are the letting agent has no obligation, other than a general duty of care of anybody under law to look after the property. But to bind them to that would be a good idea.
I think there is an area, though, Jonathan, that is still unclear in law around that, because there's a piece of legislation known as the Consumer Protection Regulations from Unfair Trading 2008, and OFT have recently produced some guidance on that for letting agents, and they're working that up at the moment in consultation with the industry. But the requirement within that legislation, simply put, is that the agent, should be telling the consumer everything that they need to know that would impact on their, what the expression used is transactional decision making. So the landlord should be being told everything that they need to know when you take a new instruction from a landlord client. Similarly, the tenant should know everything that they would be likely to need to know before they would even go and see a property. But there's no case law on it at the moment, despite the fact it's been law since 2008. And the industry is on guard, I think, would be the right way to put it at the moment. One thing that's come up in the London Borough of Newham that I mentioned earlier on is that they're saying, and I can understand it under consumer protection regulations, that when you're advertising a property, you should be advertising the maximum occupancy rate, because their licensing scheme says how many people can be in any one property. So if you've got a two-bedroom property, it could be a maximum of 5 people, i.e. a family, or a combination of that. And that should be being made clear to the consumer. Now, occupancy rates and overcrowding is something that the private rented sector housing panel in Scotland has looked at. And it is an issue in Scotland, in particular. It comes back to the Govan Hill discussion that I think it was this committee had 2 years ago, perhaps 3 years ago. It was certainly one of the committees here that had the discussion around overcrowding, antisocial behaviour and landlord registration, because they all come together. And we just need the joined-up thinking, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you. That's been very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, can I just specifically ask you, Mr Gordon, the RICS is a signatory to the United Nations Global Compact for Sustainable Development. What elements should the Code of Practice include to help the sector develop more sustainable business practice in line with the Compact's 10 principles, in particular Principle 8, which I understand undertakes initiatives to promote greater environmental responsibility?
Well, I had to refer to my policy advisor for that one. So I think the UN Global Compact is really high-level stuff, and the environmental one is quite rightly the one that... I've talked about the environmental side of things, and I think driving up standards through better quality housing, more new housing for the rented stock is probably the best way. But the RICS Scotland believes that consideration of Principle 8 in the Code of Practice is a good starting point, but the whole compact has a potential to play a role, and RICS Scotland will be able to provide further detail in its written submission.
So that should be considered in secondary legislation in terms of drawing up the codes of practice for what will happen.
I think each part of the Code of Practice could be looked at in relation to Principle 8, I think would be the idea. You wouldn't need a separate part of the code, but you would need to consider each part that's being introduced as to whether that meets it.
Okay, sorry, Patrick, you wanted to come in here, I think.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think this panel's given very clear evidence about the scale and nature of the problems the bill is intended to address, so I think it's been very helpful. And also the recognition that we need to be talking not just about competence and qualifications, but also about ethical practice as well. In thinking about this balance between what's in the legislation and what would be in the Code of Practice, I wonder if I could float a couple of suggestions and see whether you think one falls in one side or the other. I'd suggest that these issues would be well addressed in the Code of Practice. The first, Mr Gordon mentioned my earlier comments about a letting agent who had clearly decided I can't be bothered with this deposit protection lark, so I'll just charge more advance rent. And finding workarounds, finding legal workarounds. Now, if you're paying 2 months' rent and you're given a month's notice to quit, you're still going to have a fight in your hands to get your money back, and you're probably going to need to come up with 1 or 2 months' rent to get another place to live in. So it's a serious problem, how we can close down those loopholes. And the other is the continuing problem of discrimination against housing benefit claimants. We've seen a recent media outburst from a big landlord south of the border who wanted to give notice to quit to all of his housing benefit recipient tenants. But even in Scotland, there's a significant problem with the historic phrase no DSS still being very, very familiar in the private rented sector. Is that something, that kind of discrimination, something that would be effectively dealt with in the Code of Practice?
My understanding is that that term is actually illegal, but nobody has challenged it, and it really would take a practice as well. Well, yes, the practice. The practice really is driven by mortgage providers. I believe Bank of Scotland, in fact, are guilty of this, that they will not permit buy-to-let lenders who are looking to mortgage a property for renting out to rent that property to somebody who is in receipt of benefits. And I think that was driven by the introduction of universal credit. So that's my take on that.
I think so yeah, it is a very common phrase, and it's the majority of landlords that we speak to, I stated earlier that they're not wealthy people. So the majority of our clients are not wealthy people. The majority of properties that we look after, they have a mortgage, and very often the mortgage is more than the rent. They cannot afford to not receive the rent. So the affordability test is critical to that. If somebody is in receipt of benefits, then they're not excluded from our process, but we have an affordability test which is carried out by an independent company that we pay for and checks the tenant's suitability for the property to meet what we've said to the landlords will do. But in addition to that, a lot of insurance companies, in addition to the banks, will not allow DSS tenants. So the cheapest insurance you can get, that's advertised everywhere online, specifically excludes students and people claiming DSS benefits. How they define what a benefit is, I don't know, because you obviously get tax credits and different types of benefit. So you could be working or are actually likely to be working as well. But one key thing I think is, I don't think it works to... we have a couple of people who receive housing benefit and we get money direct from the council. Without notice, they will reduce that amount if the person is having money clawed back for something else they've been overpaid with. Now, that should perhaps be ring-fenced. It's providing their shelter, and perhaps the money should be paid direct to the registered agent or the registered landlord with checks in place for that. I know that empowerment is important for tenants, and that's why the money is given to them directly, but if it's all going to be used for rent, they're paying out on the basis of the rent that they're paying at a certain level, what's the point in not giving it direct? Because it leaves them to manage that. And, you know, if I didn't have any food, I would go and spend the rent on food. But it's more important to have somewhere to live, and you might try harder to find another route. Although I understand that's difficult. But, you know, you might think slightly differently if you don't have the money.
And I'm sure members can see the argument about the need for particularly a small landlord who is dependent on that income as well. But it's clearly unacceptable if someone who's an existing private rented sector tenant loses their job and then finds that they're getting thrown out of their home as well. So what can be done in the current climate to overcome this continuing discrimination?
That particular issue would be very difficult to... you certainly would not be able to do that during a fixed-term tenancy as long as the tenant carried on paying the rent. And I think there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that people are threatened with that, but there would not be a breach of the tenancy agreement in those circumstances. The difficulty arises if that tenancy comes to an end and what the practice may be after that. But as earlier evidence there has said, Council of Mortgage Lenders are working very hard with their members at the moment. Nationwide have said that buy-to-let mortgages, they will change the term. They will allow a longer tenancy than they've previously done, because one of the things that is very often in a buy-to-let mortgage deed is that no tenancy shall be created for longer than 12 months at any one time. And that's also a problem that people like Shelter will bring to you, that they would like to see people have the ability to stay longer. Now, in actual practice, many tenancies last for far longer than that. When I came out of Glasgow in 2006 to this post, I'd had a tenant in situ in a property since 1989 in the private rented sector. Perfectly happy, landlord happy as well. Landlords don't want changes of tenants if the tenant is behaving, generally speaking, unless something has impacted on their own personal circumstances. But in the current market, an investor landlord or an accidental landlord even who wants to exit the market, there are willing buyers around that will buy a property with a sitting tenant. And a good agent, in actual fact, can match these two bodies up. The English case that you referred to, I know the case exceptionally well. I've had to face that one on the media on more than one occasion because he did the same thing back in 2006. He did the same thing in 2004. I've got to be very careful what I say publicly, but I don't think the reason that he gave was the right reason. I think one of the big problems, though, for the benefit tenant is that very often the rent that they can afford or they will receive benefit for is below market rent. And you've got to look at it from the landlord's perspective. Are they maximising the return on their property? Yeah, of course you've got to look at it from both perspectives. But why, if you were being told that you were making a more socially acceptable investment by putting your money into one bank interest-free, as opposed to getting, even in today's market, 0.25 of 1%, what percentage of the population would think that that was a good deal? The rent return on your property is no different. And one of the things that we do want is institutional investment in the private rented sector. The type of thing that Jonathan was speaking about earlier on, getting new stock, quality stock, coming into the private rented sector is going to be very much yield-driven. So we have to address that. Now, I know the Scottish Government have had concerns around universal credits and everything else, and they have said that they'll do what they can to support the people in that situation. but it's a fact of life.
I think we're veering off this subject, really, and we're running out of time rapidly. Is there anything else on this before we move on to dispute level resolution and enforcement? Yes, quickly, Mr.
Very quick point. So I think the Scottish Government would do well to look at investment in the sector as the way to improve that, with the right level of affordable homes created as part of building a new rented sector, and encouraging that sector would be a massive part in doing it. And if you have 25% of houses, or 20% I think it is, that have to be affordable, then you will create more homes that people can really afford. And if the government is not able to do everything that's required to allow a tenant to stay in a property when they fall into hard times, I don't think it's feasible for an individual person who's only just got enough money to feed their own family and happens to be a landlord to be the one that steps in to support that person who can't afford to pay the rent. So I don't think anybody would be thrown out for losing their job. I think they'd be thrown out or not thrown out. The process would be started to evict them through the correct legal process if they can't afford to pay the rent, or if they stop paying the rent. But a professional and ethical body looking after a landlord that tried to do anything else wouldn't last very long. But yeah, I'll stop so you can move on.
I just want to make one final point, if I may, which is coming back to the point I made at the outset in support of Professor McClellan, which is that there needs to be a bigger strategy. The barrier for investment into new build for the PRS is quoted apparently as the cost of land. There are investors effectively sterilising land that could be used for building. The Scottish Government could look at that and look at freeing up or ring-fencing land and not allowing it to be bought by investors.
That's local authorities. But right, okay, let's move on to dispute resolution and enforcement. Gordon.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. What types of mechanisms currently exist for resolving disputes between letting agents and their customers? How effective and fair are these procedures for resolving customer complaints, and how aware are people of these existing schemes?
I don't mind starting that one off. The Ombudsman schemes that we referred to earlier on are the most common ones that are used today. They are independent. The Ombudsman bodies are not controlled by the industry, and they do work, and they are cost-efficient business models. And that's where, as I expressed earlier on, I do have concerns about the costs that are quoted in the support papers to the bill on using PRHP. Typically, the cost of dispute resolution going to the Ombudsman, either of the Ombudsman, is under £250, as opposed to the figure that's quoted at, as I said earlier on, £1,600 to £1,800. I think one of the things that we have to look at is whether, for some of the issues that are likely to be areas of complaint, we could come up with something as simple as ADR, which is working quite effectively for tenancy deposit cases. And the schemes that are running tenancy deposit protection, ADR, their costs range from about £80 to £150. And it's a desktop exercise. There could be a requirement for a higher level, more complicated route to it. I don't have a problem with that, but I think we've got to look at how quickly and efficiently some of the problems can be addressed. And obviously a code of conduct that has a requirement for an agent to have dispute resolution themselves, an internal complaints procedure, because very often it's a more junior member of staff that digs in their heels and says, no, that's not right. And it gets to the boss, and the boss has a solution to the problem. I know that I used to spend money as an agent to keep both sides happy.
Can I come in here? I think there's an element here also about the education and empowerment of the tenant, that the better their education of what the circumstances are and their rights and responsibilities, the more likely we are to be able to move into the area that Ian has just been talking about, which is where the problem area gets captured and dealt with sooner rather than later. And it's that escalation process that is actually often the problem. And I think yes, okay, better informed tenants would be a big...
I think that leads on to your next question then, Gordon.
Yeah, what are your views on the Bill's proposals regarding how tenants and landlords could seek to enforce a letting agent's compliance with the letting agent code of practice? And do you agree with the government that the proposals provide easy access to a redress mechanism?
So I think the government's proposals are good. I think they've thought about it in the right way. I think the difficulty is that the private rented housing panel is the best example of a tribunal at the moment, and it is not it's not operating as it's meant to. So people who have problems with the repairing standard are not going to the private rented housing panel, or their cases are taking too long to be resolved. So investment in that would be key. But I think the RICS's view on tribunals and ombudsmen is that the best placed people to manage disputes between letting agents and their clients, whether that's a landlord or a tenant, would be an ombudsman. The two ombudsman schemes that are in place at the moment are credible and have as Ian said, good low-cost solutions for people and easy access. Tribunals would be fine as well if that's the way that they want to be done. I think it's unnecessary to add another layer that the government gets involved in. I think if it can be done with a scheme that already operates, why introduce another one? I think extensive tribunals to take cases away from the Sheriff Court is a good idea, but perhaps the registration side of letting agents is something that could be done with ombudsmen. I think the final thing I would say about that is that there's a very disparate set of organisations and bodies and a huge number of codes of conduct. Nobody understands what it's like at the moment. There's a danger that if the Scottish Government adds another level to any part of it as in what they're doing, what's the need to do that? So Arla is well known in England as being a licensing body for letting agents and has a strict code of conduct. The RICS, I would say, has in addition to that, in terms of its professional development side of things, so the training is slightly more entrenched in terms of what's required on an ongoing basis. But as Ian said, they provide training to members, and it's something that they're supposed to do. Why would you not take something that's there already? Why spend £500,000 or £1 million setting up a scheme which nobody will comply with, or that you would have to set up an enforcement body? If you try and call trading standards at Edinburgh Council, you can't get through to them. You can get through to a CAB helpline. I understand that is where the route you would go through if you were wanting to complain about a letting agent at the moment. So, why not take advantage of the bodies that are there? The RICS has already white labelled the regulation of other sectors, so the Institute of Residential Property Managers and ARMA, which are both working in similar sectors in terms of property management, have their members regulated by the RICS at the moment. The RICS is obviously regulating every surveyor that values a house for sale. There are experienced practitioners within RICS regulation that have already written to the government offering advice on 3 ways that they could help. So it could be, top level, you have to be a surveyor. Then next level, they would provide the regulation for it in a white label format. And then the other way, they would set up the code and manage it for the government. So there's lots of stuff there that could be done. Set up the fit and proper test, establish the code of practice that everybody has to stick to, use the Ombudsman's services that are already in existence that are low cost and work well for consumers, and then get something that's already there to manage it on. Either Arla or the RSS or a combination of both, or you could choose which one, or you could even do with the tenancy deposit scheme and say this is what a company has to do to run a deposit scheme, and then 3 companies, including one that the RICS is involved in, set up schemes and companies which are independent to actually do that. They don't get involved in the enforcement, which would be something you would want to add, but they're set up and they've all got their own rules and guidance, but it's pretty much what the government wrote that said that they had to comply with it. Why not do something like that and let the market that already has experienced people take over the role? And that would be my main suggestion for the evidence.
Any other suggestion quickly? Yes, Pascal.
I don't think it's a suggestion, it's really an observation. At the moment, we do have a lot of different bodies, not all of whom know what they are meant to be regulating. For example, trading standards in Highland, sadly, were not aware that they were meant to be overseeing the display of energy performance certificates. You know, they needed me to tell them where they could find out about this. We've got the local authority regulating landlords. We've got the Scottish Government coming in to regulate letting agents, the police regulating certain aspects, private rented housing panel, the Ombudsman, RICS, ARLA. What I think we need is just one overall body with that overview and that ability to regulate the system so that it's much clearer and therefore much, much easier to enforce. I don't have a suggestion as to who or how that should be.
Okay, thanks. Mark.
Thanks, Claire. We've heard previously of concerns that the existing private rented sector legislative requirements such as private landlord registration schemes aren't being enforced effectively, and that's come through in opening remarks that enforcement you feel would be key. Do you have any concerns over the government's ability to enforce the letting agent registration requirements?
I query whether government can enforce its own legislation effectively. And that would be my main concern, because where this is all sitting is that the enforcing body is the government. And what I think I'm still trying to work out in my own head is how they're actually going to devolve that down, where it's going to go, and who's going to have that responsibility. I think to pick up on a point that Kathleen made there, something that's happened south of the border but hasn't been able to be extended north of the border is a scheme known as primary authority, whereby one local trading standards department can provide what's known as assured advice that every other trading standards officer within the jurisdiction, and we're speaking about England at the moment, would abide by. So you get then the uniformity of standard and enforcement coming out in it, and it makes it much easier for everyone to know where to go and get that advice. Now, it's in its infancy. I will be perfectly honest as far as the private rented sector is concerned, but since we launched our scheme in October, we have nearly 1,000 agents signed up to it, and we're starting to see the cases coming through, being referred, the advice going back very quickly, very clearly, and other local authorities, trading standards, accepting it. And I think something like that is workable and could be made to happen within Scottish legislation at the moment as well.
Could I come in there? I can think back to, I'm guessing 5 or 6 years back, when I believe it was Edinburgh City Council ran, now was it Letwise, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was excellent, very, very high standard training sessions for landlords. We actually travelled down from Inverness to come to these, because there is such a lack really of training opportunities. People are eager for knowledge, they want to do a good job. You know, there are many of us out there really trying to raise the bar, and I think this could be something that could be looked at, and it could be that it could cover a lot of these areas.
Okay.
I suppose there's a theme within the things that I'm saying about regulation needing enforcement by a proper professional body, and it comes down to the bit. So there are good letting agents that do everything right and they know exactly what they're doing, and that's the top percentage. There's a few bad ones at the bottom that are either don't care whether they do everything right as long as they get the money, or they're deliberately trying to do things to make more money. The vast majority of letting agents, I would argue, that there's a big percentage that just have this lack of understanding and knowledge, but the vast majority really do want to do a good job, and the self-regulation model is something that even the hardest campaigners and other things like press or whatever that support that sort of thing, the government's trying to improve redress for tenants in the court system by moving those away from the court system to specialist tribunals where housing people look at it. The best people to regulate the sector are the people that know how the sector should work. there's a massive lack of information for tenants, landlords and for the government, I think. So whenever they look at something, they interview people like us and they get anecdotal evidence of things that are happening in the market. But there's 1,000 letting agents and you don't know anything about the 700 that are not members of any trade body, but even the ones that are, there's no compulsion on them to do anything right. It's just there's no formalisation of stuff. Why not take the opportunity at this stage? The Scottish Government is quite unique within the UK in wanting to regulate housing to improve standards. I think the best route to do that is to create a single body that will self-regulate using the people that understand the market. And you know, why would the government want to get tied up in something that people will then complain about? Why not set it off into the market in the right way and have proper self-regulation that's enforced by an independent body?
You want to carry on, Mark?
A number of a range of offences that the bill provides for. Just to ask what your views on those offences were and whether they were proportionate.
I just believe that the levels of fines are set out quite clearly, but we would have a concern that it appears that the levels of fines are lower than they are for non-compliance with landlord registration, which seems strange. Once I spotted that, I didn't have time to look into the detail of it, but I believe for a particular offence, it's level 3. I don't even know which way it works, so I apologise. But I think if you look into it, it doesn't match or meet the same level as the landlord registration.
That's correct.
Okay. What actions will letting agents be required to carry out to comply with the registration scheme? Do you think it will create any undue regulatory burdens?
It should do, otherwise why do it?
I think it will vary across the market generally. Some will not have to do anything, and some will have to have a long, hard look at what they are currently doing as their business model and everything else. They're the ones where the impact will be greatest, but they're also the ones, I think, where we all share, including yourselves, I'm absolutely sure that that's where the biggest problems arise, and therefore I don't think we should be frightened of that regulatory impact.
I think there's obviously a cost implication on this. One of the comments I made in a meeting with Shelter some months ago was that I felt that the cost for a landlord registration is actually, frankly, too low. So I think it's, again, finding a balance to make sure that the regulatory costs and the efforts done in order to actually meet it, all the code of practice and everything else, is in balance with the size of the business that you're dealing with.
Can I come back on one point? I think the cost is an important issue. So the RICS feels quite strongly that its members, and particularly its regulated firms, which are operating as a limited company or whatever, our cost of regulation can be well over £1,000, and that's not counting the high level of professional indemnity insurance that we have to have. We feel that it would be an unnecessary burden on regulated firms of chartered surveyors to have to pay another fee to a government registration scheme in order to adhere to a lower set of standards. The RSS already heavily regulates its members, and it might create confusion in the market, and particularly within members' operations, if they had to comply with 2 codes of conduct. The Law Society mentioned similar things, but I think the Law Society has particular pieces of legislation that it deals with in terms of signing documents that is covered by their own code of practice, but management of property is something that surveyors, and it's core to what surveyors do. Why would they be regulated by somebody else when there's already a strong regulation in place?
Just in terms of cost, yeah, I think we accept that there will be a cost for this, but just to echo what Jonathan has said, our fee, we are a very small firm. It's myself, my husband, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of the CLA, but just to put this into context, CLA members, I believe, our fee for membership is £295. So as a firm, personally, we are paying that. We're paying into Safe Agent, Landlord Accreditation Scotland, Arla and RICS, and last year my accountant tells us that our fees to these bodies was just short of £3,000. So I think, some of us might take unkindly to a hefty fee, of several hundreds of pounds, unless it's actually going to achieve what you are trying to do. So please make this something with teeth.
Yeah, I would add to that very briefly that there's a competition issue and a risk to businesses that are already accredited and providing a good service, in that everybody else is going to be legitimised by this term regulation. They will be unregulated if it's enacted as it is, unless it's changed. And if that comes into force, people will automatically start talking about regulation, even if they mean registration. And I just think that would be extremely unfair. At the moment, we're able to set ourselves apart as being qualified and regulated. But if I say that to somebody, once this scheme comes into force as it's enacted at the moment, as it's set out at the moment, then when I say that, the other letting agent will be able to come in and say, and they'll say, well, are you regulated? And they'll say, yeah, we're regulated by the Scottish Government. Surely that's better. And I think that would be...
Okay, I think we've got the point there. Yeah. Are you finished, Mark? Yeah, okay. Gentlemen and ladies, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered? We've had a fairly long and detailed session, and it's been extremely good for our benefit. So can I... Yes, Scal.
Sorry, there's just one last thing that I do have a concern about, that if a letting agent has been removed from the register, can that letting agent set up as a new partnership, a new limited company, whatever, and re-register? How do you propose to deal with that?
Okay, we'll certainly pass that on. Mr. Gordon.
I've talked a lot about enforcement, and I want to make it clear that we support the government's intention to regulate letting agents. We just feel that it needs another couple of points on it. It's been mentioned in some of the things. I've actually watched TV or videos of evidence that's gone on so far, and electrical safety and fire safety has come up. So just got a quick bit about that. So the Scottish Government's own figures show that the number of accidental residential fires is falling each year. However, the number of fires caused by faulty electrical wiring or installations is number one, and it's rising. There were 373 accidental dwelling fires noted last year out of 5,000, where the source of ignition is listed as the electricity supply. There are over 600 more where an appliance is listed as the cause. Unfortunately, the data is not clear enough as to whether this is rented properties or not, but we could assume that it's 20% of properties, or perhaps the sector's worse, because people look after their own one first, more importantly. Legislation on gas safety is very clear in that all landlords have a duty of care to the tenant and must provide safe gas installations. The relevant legislation is also very clear that this must be achieved by way of an annual gas safety inspection. Legislation on electrical safety is also very clear in that all landlords have a duty of care to the tenant and must provide a safe electrical installation and appliances. But unfortunately, the relevant legislation is not clear about how this is achieved, with the result that most landlords do not carry out electrical wiring and installation checks by way of an EICR or portable appliance testing, although anecdotal evidence strangely suggests that more people check the kettle works than the socket that it goes into. This is likely to mean that many, or perhaps even the majority of properties let out privately are not safe. Letting agents in particular, because that's relevant in this bill, often advise people we're trying to win their business from that they do not have to carry out electrical safety checks, when we believe that this is not correct, because they're failing their duty to the tenant to provide a safe system by not checking it. And the smoke alarms is a confusing issue within the repairing standard. It's a requirement to have a suitable smoke alarm, but nobody's telling anyone what that suitable smoke alarm should mean. Battery smoke alarms are unreliable. Tenants take the batteries out, and they often fail and don't work as well as a mains-operated smoke alarm. Legislation under the Housing 2006 Act introduced the repairing standard, which is quite well drafted, but we think it should be amended to include provisions to make main smoke alarms and the suitable provision of them mandatory, as well as electrical safety checks that I've mentioned before, and with new building standards saying that any new gas installation should have a CO alarm in that room, it seems strange to have that left out of the letting legislation, and we feel that CO alarms should be compulsory within the rooms where people have a gas appliance.
Could I just add that letting agents who choose to sign up and be members of Landlord Accreditation Scotland do have to insist that landlords provide an EICR report and fire blankets and so on. So there are higher standards, and that's an excellent thing.
Okay. Everybody satisfied? Thank you very much for your evidence. That's been really good. I'll let you leave the room, and we just want a couple of more minutes with the committee. So if you'd like to leave the room, thank you very much. We're moving into private session.